The ancient poem said that everyone's destiny is overcome, and every mortal must do his duty and suppress his desires. However, our hero resisted fate, because he knew that such rules only applied to mere mortals. He never stopped improving and strengthening himself. Dick believed that neither a gifted person nor fate could stop him. He was the only son of the 9th Emperor. When he had almost finished training, a girl approached him. Without turning to face her, Dick first put away his sword. Dick's fiancée, Sarah, whom he had known since childhood, came to see him. The guy was happy to see her. He wanted to ask why she came, but he didn't have time to finish. It turns out that Sarah stabbed him. Dick didn't understand why she did this, because she was the love of his life. He finally found the strength to ask the question, but Sarah remained silent. The girl he loved turned out to be a completely different person. She left, deciding to leave Dick to die. But suddenly Dick woke up. Suddenly a woman came up to him and asked if he had had the nightmare again. Seeing her, Dick calmed down a little. After all, his mother was in front of him, and she was simply worried about him. Leah said that Dick had been weak since childhood, and now illness had confined him to his bed. But in fact, Leah's real son died in bed 3 days ago. Without knowing this, she offered Dick medication. She was a stranger to Dick, but from the moment he woke up, Leah had been constantly caring for him. This made him happy, because in his past life he had never seen his mother. But now he had the opportunity to feel his mother's love. Suddenly she told Dick that for 3 days now he had been waking up from nightmares and saying Sarah's name. She didn't have time to finish speaking because a noise was heard outside. There was a crowd of people gathered near the palace, but the maid did not let them through. She said that they were not allowed to enter the Jade Palace, but at that moment someone hit her. Flying back, the girl hit her back against a pole. This even made her bleed. The prince was outraged that the maid blocked his way. The 8th prince asked if she was seeking her death. Opening the door, Leah asked the maid what had happened. Seeing the girl lying on the ground, Leah ran up to her. Right after she said that it was a palace, and even the prince had no right to break in here. But the prince reported that the queen had ordered them to be exiled to a side palace. Leah was a little indignant about this, but did not argue. As she led the maid away, she promised the prince that they would move tomorrow. But then she was told that the queen wanted them to leave right now. Leah tried to object and explain what state Dick was in now, but she was interrupted and told that many people had died in the world, few of whom deserved pity. The prince asked why the 9th prince should live at all if he was so weak. Hearing this, Leah was horrified. She tried to remind him that they were brothers, but at that moment Dick interrupted their conversation. Moving with difficulty, he said that they would move now. Leah asked why he had come out here if it was cold, but Dick only replied that they didn't need to beg anyone. He said that sooner or later they would still come back here. After a moment of silence, Leah nodded. In his past life, Dick had never experienced such suffering. Now there was no longer a place for them in the palace, since his mother had lost her position. In this world, only those who were strong and had connections received everything. And for the weak, the only path left was to death. Arriving at the new modest house, Dick asked if there would be a sacrifice ceremony tomorrow. He told his mother that he would definitely open the Seal of Power tomorrow. The Seal of Power was a kind of qualification given by the gods. Dick's brother had opened the seal when he was 10 years old, so he was now powerful. Dick was already 16, but he still had not opened the seal. Leah knew Dick's chances weren't great, but she only encouraged him. Afterwards, she asked Dick to go to bed earlier. But suddenly I remembered something. She asked Dick who the Sarah was that he had spoken about in his dream. Hearing that it was no one, his mother asked him not to say that name again, even in his sleep. After all, Sarah was the one who united 9 empires and ruled over all lands. She told Dick that calling the Empress by her first name was disrespectful, so no one should hear Dick. The sacrifice ceremony was a public celebration. During the festival, children received their sacred mark. Seeing Dick, his brother joked that he had come only to embarrass himself. The 6th prince supported him, because only the Dick still did not have a mark. Dick remained silent while listening to them. But the 6th one continued to press the issue and ask what the meaning of Dick's life was. Then the 9th prince intervened and said that it was difficult for a commoner to receive a mark. So maybe Dick was not their brother at all. Dick was angry, but he understood that while he was weak, there was no point in useless arguments. Besides, he didn't expect that after so many years, he would have this item. Then the commander-in-chief announced the beginning of the ceremony. As soon as he said this, the maids began to ring the bells, and one guy was getting ready to kill a pig. When her blood spilled, everyone saw a bright golden light. Many were delighted to see the sacred marks. Then their first owners appeared. A 6-year-old boy received a 4th grade mark, which meant he had a good future ahead of him. The father was proud of his son and decided to throw a feast in his honor. Meanwhile, the marks continued to find owners. However, this bypassed Dick. He became alarmed because the ceremony was already coming to an end. But at that moment the last mark appeared. When Dick saw her, he immediately noticed that she was unusual, and it was she who now belonged to him. As the mark reached him, light began to gather around Dick. Dick couldn't believe it when it happened. Everyone was surprised, because it was impossible to receive a mark after 16 years. Dick's brothers couldn't believe it either. Soon the monk reported that Dick had received the mark. The queen asked to bring the boy to her. Meanwhile, Leah was glad that Dick had succeeded. At that moment, the man congratulated Dick and said that the queen wanted to see him. But Leah immediately stood between them, clearly frightened. Seeing his mother's reaction, Dick thought the queen was very cunning. Then he decided to follow the monk himself. Meanwhile, the queen was wondering what class Dick's mark belonged to. The commander-in-chief reported that none of the marks listed in the Bible matched Dick's mark. The queen decided that this meant that the mark had no class, and ordered that the boy be given the bare minimum of resource support, so as not to waste money on him. Leah was outraged that the other princes were given much more resources. But the queen said that princes cannot be compared. The prince supported the queen, because the seventh prince inherited all the power from the queen, and he said that the tip of his brother's finger was much more important than Dick's life. Then Leah said that the eighth prince was given 4 bottles. The queen explained that the one with the greatest talent received more resources, and Dick was the weakest. Leah continued to insist. The queen became angry and told Leah not to dare to contradict her anymore, otherwise she would fail again. Dick was surprised when he heard this. Then he turned to his mother, who no longer dared to object. At that moment, the maid asked Dick to take back one of the bottles given to him. Taking the bottle, Dick invited his mother to come back. Finally, the queen told Dick that the annual assessment would take place in 3 months, so he should try his best. But the prince replied that Dick could not succeed in just 3 months. But Dick mentally asked them to wait, because he would not disappoint them. Soon after, he began training. Since Dick had previous experience in cultivation, he clearly understood how he needed to proceed. Already today he wanted to achieve certain results. He understood that he only needed to take 1 step to the first meridian. There was always mana hovering around him. Previously it was concentrated, but suddenly it dissipated. Then Dick was breathing heavily. After catching his breath, he thought that he had managed to reach the original level of the yellow realm. The practice was divided into yellow, black, earthly, and heavenly realms, and the realms were further divided into several levels. Up to the advanced level, a person's strength only increased. At an advanced level, many could develop the bull power technique, and then the strength of 4 bulls, which was 4 times stronger. This is what Dick wanted to achieve in 3 months. Occasionally Leah would watch Dick. She decided not to disturb her son since he was so focused. All Leah could do was provide him with a better environment and resources. A little while later she left. Meanwhile, Dick continued to move towards his goal. There was more mana around his mark now. He thought that after 9 circulations, the amount of true chi had increased. He developed quickly, but that was not enough for him. Dick thought that with a spirit crystal his practice would improve. But suddenly he was surprised by this thought. After all, it seems he had one such crystal. As soon as Dick picked up the object, mana began to hover around him again, and the mark on his forehead burned even brighter. Suddenly he saw some symbols above his hand. It seemed strange to him that this had never happened before in his practice. And even though he saw the symbols for the first time, he still understood them. Suddenly Dick thought that his mark might be a natural phenomenon. In nature, most crystals did not have an individual essence, but there were those that could help warriors with a sacred mark that had the same attributes as the crystal. However, he had never heard of a space-time crystal before. Lost in thought, he stared at his hand. Suddenly he noticed that something resembling a mark appeared in the room, and then Dick got sucked in. Finding himself in another space, he began to fall down, and eventually collided with the surface. Then he was glad that steel was stronger, otherwise his body would not have survived it. Afterwards, he began to look around. Suddenly he noticed some notebook and a scroll. First he took up the scroll, but Dick couldn't move it. Then he applied more force, but still to no avail. He could not move the scroll or open it. Because of this, he decided to check the book. Then he learned that there was someone who had the same mark as Dick. However, that man was the last one. According to that monk, only 2 people had such a mark, and with Dick there were 3 of them. But in the place where Dick was now, time flowed differently. 3 days here were equal to 1 in the real world, and this made the boy happy. Dick cursed as he accidentally skipped a page. And while reading, I was suddenly surprised. Afterwards, he looked at the scroll, wanting to quickly find out what was inside. But at that moment, his stomach began to rumble. He soon returned to his mother and realized that his usual diet was no longer enough for him. His mother told him that since he now had a sacred mark, he should not eat ordinary food. So she offered him 10 tablets of blood. But Dick was surprised, because even 1 pill cost 10 silver coins. The maid suddenly said that Leah had exchanged her favorite gold hairpin for this. Then Leah looked at the maid with displeasure, and she told Dick that it didn't matter because she wanted to support her son. Then Dick promised to do everything he could to become a warrior and protect her. He couldn't yet talk about his successes, because if they found out about it, they would try to set him up. The maid told Leah that a warrior should not only take pills, but also develop the meridians. Leah understood this, but even the lowest level of exercise was too expensive. But for the sake of her son, she was ready to ask anyone for help, even turning to a family with whom she had not communicated for a long time. The maid reassured her that it was not Leah's fault that what happened. 3 days later, Dick continued training as well. He decided to use one of his techniques. He hit the stone with all his might. The stone fell apart and left an even mark on it. Seeing this, Dick thought that his training had already paid off and he could use this technique. Now he could develop a new meridian, but he did not know where to get another bottle that the queen gave him. Suddenly a maid came up and asked what Dick was doing there. Dick merely replied that he had gone out for some air. After listening to Dick, the girl asked him to follow her, because Her Majesty wanted to see him. When the maid spoke about that girl, Dick got the impression that for the previous owner of his body, this girl was someone special. Soon they arrived at the desired estate. At that moment, Dick realized that his mother was from a noble family, but for some reason she was not supported. His mother also mentioned the girl, glad that now she and Dick would have more topics to talk about. Soon they were met, and it was decided to accompany them. Dick was allowed to do whatever he wanted, so the maid suggested that he go see Rihanna. When Dick agreed, he was taken to the training ground. Looking ahead, Dick was surprised. Rihanna's skills had already reached the intermediate level of the Yellow Realm, which was impressive. Many people watched the girl and were also delighted with her. But at that moment people noticed the Wild One and began to whisper. People were whispering that Dick had previously been in love with Rihanna, but now the girl was engaged. This made Dick angry. Meanwhile, Leah asked her older brother for help and asked him to give Dick the skill book. But the man became angry and asked why he should help if 3 years ago Leah refused to help her nephew. Afterwards, he told her to leave, since they had already broken off relations a long time ago. In despair, Leah fell to her knees, and she said that she wanted to see her father, but it turned out that he was away, and they also warned Dick to stay away from Rihanna. This saddened Leah, because she knew how much Dick liked Rihanna. The man explained that he had found a good match for her, but Leah doubted that the girl wanted to get married only for the good of the family. Then they told her that it was Rihanna who made the decision. Meanwhile, everyone was delighted with the girl, who was called Blessed. Rihanna talked to Dick about his mark, but the guy explained that he had no class. The girl continued that although Dick would not achieve great success, at least his body would now be healthier. But Dick replied that he would work hard and try to catch up with her. But the girl replied that Dick would most likely never even be able to reach the intermediate level. She asked Dick not to jump above his head, otherwise there would be consequences. Dick didn't understand why the previous owner of his body liked such an arrogant girl. But Rihanna wanted to tell you something else. She thought that if she told him about her engagement, Dick would lose heart. People gathered around, also interested in Dick's reaction. There was silence for a moment. Afterwards, Dick dryly congratulated the girl and began to leave. His reaction surprised Rihanna. She was surprised that he didn't even want to ask the reason, and Dick replied that now he just wanted to find his mother. It was just at that moment that he noticed her. Seeing that she was crying, Dick began to worry. At that moment, the man offered Dick a book to study the skills and 2 bottles of liquid. Then Dick realized that his mother must have had to endure a lot of humiliation for this. But Dick refused to accept them, and suggested that his mother leave. Some people started to laugh at this, while others were indignant. Rihanna noticed that Dick had changed, but she was told it was because he had recently received the mark. The girl did not argue with her father and agreed. Instead, she decided to focus on herself, because she and Dick were completely different. Dick thought that he needed resources to improve, but he didn't have the money for them. Then he decided that he could write down and sell the techniques he had learned in his past life. The skills were divided into 4 classes, and the higher the class, the more difficult the practice. Dick decided to sell low-end equipment, but he knew that even this would raise the whole district on its ears. Afterwards, he decided to write the lowest class he remembered. At this point, the middle class of this stage was the limit for him, but he believed that now they could be considered the best, and he decided that the book he wrote would pay for itself. Late at night, he came to the fighting market. The guards asked where Dick was going so late. The guy explained that he wanted to see Rihanna. When he was let through, Dick heard him being discussed again. Soon he decided to put on a cloak, and having camouflaged himself, he moved forward. The market was well guarded, and only a few people could enter. But Dick knew that he would only make a big profit at auction. So he asked one girl for a deacon from the central auction. The girl asked him to wait, since it was usually occupied by VIPs. Soon she brought the man to the guy, but suddenly he was surprised. He noticed boots that only people from the palace could wear. Then he invited the guy inside. Dick had put on those shoes on purpose, so he grinned. He told the chief appraiser that he wanted to put the item up for auction. And then he took out the crystal. With its help, he pulled out a book that contained intermediate-level sword techniques. After examining the book, the starting bid was set at 200,000 silver pieces. The auction had its nuances, which Dick immediately agreed to. A few hours later, Dick was informed that his book had been sold for more than $1 million, but he was surprised to hear that Rihanna's father had bought the book. Soon the buyers were brought to Dick. The man also immediately noticed Dick's boots. He wanted to know the seller's name, but the guy refused. Opening the book, the man realized that it contained low-class techniques. And with this, their family will become stronger. Having taken the book, the man immediately decided to say goodbye to Dick. Already on the street, the father and daughter were talking about how suspicious the guy was. My father also said that the drawings were fresh, as if they had been made today. And if a person had written the technique so quickly, he must be very strong. This surprised Rihanna. Her father only told her that this book would be good for Rihanna. My daughter agreed to study using this book. Dick had already exchanged the money he received for crystals, but kept a little for himself. However, he soon decided to spend them on pellets and bottles of liquid, and also an ointment for regeneration. After that, he returned home. The girl was surprised that Dick hadn't even gone to bed yet. Then Dick said that he had bought an ointment for the maid, with the help of which she would recover faster. The girl accepted the gift with surprise, because she knew that even the ointment was very expensive. The guy briefly told her that he had his own secrets. And then he asked the maid why his mother had broken off contact with her family. The maid said that they had previously deliberately hidden this from Dick. She continued that Dick probably remembered his cousin, who had already completed the yellow area long ago. But 3 years ago he insulted someone, and for that his legs were broken. But Dick didn't understand who was capable of such a thing. But it turns out that guy insulted the 7th prince. After the incident, the brother asked his sister Leah for help. But when Leah went to the king, she encountered the queen, who angrily flogged her. Dick was angry that the king didn't care about what happened. But it turns out the king learned the truth. Dick's cousin was to blame for everything. Leah's relatives did not dare to insult the king, and decided to take it out on her. Thinking that she was unable to reach an agreement, Dick thought his cousin had been executed, but the maid said that the boy was brought to the palace, made a eunuch, and then sent into slavery. Dick realized what a shame this was for Leah's relatives. The maid admitted that she did not understand why Rihanna was given in marriage to the 7th prince after that. Dick decided that this was a way for Rihanna's family to strengthen their position. Afterwards, Dick decided to go and rest. The maid thought that Dick had changed a lot lately. Dick also realized that without strength, he would achieve nothing. So tonight he wanted to reach a new meridian. In the past, Dick was invulnerable among his peers. He was constantly rushing himself and wanted to open 3 meridians as soon as possible. At some point, energy enveloped him. It turns out that he was able to open the 3rd meridian. Afterwards, he decided to take a pill and continued to improve. At the same time, he continued to think about all the resources he needed. A few hours later, he decided to take a bath. He was motivated by the fact that only by going through suffering can one become human. Dick had a unique advantage. The time stone gave 3 times more time for training. 10 days passed outside, but a whole month passed inside the crystal. Looking in the mirror, Dick could already see how his body had changed. He was glad that today he would prepare for the final stage of the yellow area. Suddenly there was a knock on his door. When he opened the door, he found out that at his request, the maid had bought back all the jewelry that his mother had sold. Dick asked to do the same in the future if his mother sold the jewelry again. And then he admitted that he wanted to surprise her later. Having said goodbye to the maid, he continued his training. He was a little short of the 6th meridian, but Dick decided to take a chance. Then he bit the pill. And again he was enveloped in a lot of mana. Soon she began to concentrate around his mark. It turns out that a breakthrough has occurred to the final stage of the yellow region. Afterwards he went outside. The maid immediately asked if there was any progress. But Dick didn't answer and froze. Then he began to chant a spell to himself. And I was able to apply one of the techniques. He tried it on a nearby stone. Seeing it crumble to dust, Dick was pleased with his strength. Meanwhile, the maid stood behind, and she said that Dick succeeded. The next day, Dick decided to look around in one of the best stores. Suddenly, an old man crept up to him unnoticed. The old man introduced himself as the owner of the local store. Greeting the old man, Dick asked him for 80 different pills. Inviting the guy inside, the old man said that Dick would not have found so many pills anywhere else. Having made the purchase, Dick promised that he would only buy pills here. The old man happily asked if the boy wanted to buy anything else. Dick needed something, but he doubted there was such an item here. But the old man guessed that Dick needed a weapon. Then he pointed to the guy who would take Dick to the weapons pavilion. But when he began to refuse to take Dick, The old man threatened that the boy would be left without pills. Then he immediately agreed to lead Dick, and they said goodbye. Afterwards, Dick started talking to the guy about the owner's wife, because of whom he didn't want to go. He said that the woman could take a man's soul, and all her ex-husbands died on their wedding night. When they arrived at the right place, the guard asked them to wait. The hostess was informed where exactly the guests came from, but the hostess was tired and didn't want to receive any more guests. She was told that Dick looked about 16 years old. Suddenly the woman replied that all her fatigue had disappeared. After that, she invited Dick to come in. Coming out to Dick, she asked which palace he came from, and she asked what kind of weapon he needed. Dick did not respond to her seduction, and replied that he needed a sword. Seeing that the guy didn't react, she was surprised that Dick had such mental strength. After that, she escorted Dick to the armory. Dick's escort was already beginning to worry, because no one who went inside with the hostess returned untouched. Only a master could reveal the full potential of a combat weapon. The hostess offered Dick various weapons, and asked him to let him know if he liked anything. Dick's gaze immediately fell on something. He saw a sword hanging on the wall, but in fact, Dick recognized this weapon, which was called the Deep Abyss. The owner said that the sword had a 1,000-year history, but no one had been able to decipher its composition. While Dick was examining the sword, he was offered to buy it. He asked the price and was offered 1,000 silver coins. Without hesitation, the guy immediately agreed. The hostess was offended by the fact that Dick was more interested in the broken sword than in her. Then she hugged Dick and asked if he was going to buy just the sword. She asked if he was interested in anything else. Quickly moving away from her, Dick pointed to another sword and asked how much it cost. Then the owner told about its characteristics, and it cost 30,000. Dick agreed to take the sword and ran away from his mistress in a hurry. After he left, the woman said that he would not run away from her anyway. Meanwhile, the 8th prince was greeting the guests. He told the girl that he would call her sister, because their parents came from the same family. Mira thanked him for his kindness. She came to see the 1st and 7th prince, but the 7th was currently away. When the 8th invited the girl to their upcoming event, she thanked him again. Suddenly, the 8th noticed the wild man, and was surprised that the guy was able to buy a weapon. And then he said that if Dick did something shameful, the 8th would break his legs. But then the hostess intervened and said that she would not allow her guests to be beaten. The boy objected that Dick was bringing shame on their family, and Mira watched and did not understand what was happening. Dick didn't like the current situation, so he decided to leave, and the owner asked him to come back. She was happy to see Dick again if he needed anything. Dick was a little surprised that after hundreds of years the sword no longer had its former power. To restore the sword, you will need a blacksmith of at least level 5. Putting away the sword, he wondered what effect the other sword he had bought had. Because of this, the guy decided to test it. When Dick activated the power letters, the sword became almost 50 kilograms heavier. The sword was so heavy that Dick could not control it. Because of this, he decided to try other scripts. Dick decided to activate the ice writing. Having tried the sword, he came to the conclusion that he had spent his money well. He was pleased that this way he would be able to fully test the potential of combat weapons. 2 months passed, and Dick was not the only one who continued his training. His brother also never stopped improving. The 8th prince was overjoyed when he was able to break through to the minor stage of the Yellow Realm. Upon learning of this, his mother sternly said that upon learning of this, his father would reward the boy. 8th thought that Dick's presence would make him look even better in his father's eyes. But his mother replied that Dick probably wouldn't even come. But the guy replied that it was not Dick's decision whether to participate or not. Many people watched Ryan's training with admiration. She already knew many new techniques, which turned out to be quite powerful. Seeing her strength, everyone admired her. The father said that she was amazed by her daughter's progress, as she had mastered the technique of a spirit-level sword in less than 4 months. But the girl replied that her long cultivation contributed to this. Her father was proud of her, because only 10 people at the age of 20 had achieved such success, and she was 15. Agreeing with her father, Rihanna continued training. Meanwhile, Dick was about to begin mastering the scarlet stage of the yellow area. His body was very weak now, but with effort he would be able to open the 11 meridians. Afterwards, he drank 1 bottle of liquid. This helped him break through to the minor stage of the yellow region. Now Dick wanted to test what he was capable of. A few days later, he went far into the mountains, and he applied one of the new techniques. Dick decided to use the technique on one of the rocks, and I learned that the explosive force is equal to the force of 8 bulls. Since he had achieved success, he decided to try his sword again. Taking out his sword, he struck it against the rock. Then several more of the same appeared next to Dick's sword. They all pierced the rock at the same time. Dick thought with glee that if he used this in front of people, their eyes would pop out of their heads. Afterwards, he decided to try a defensive sword technique. Then everything around was flooded with light. Dick believed that this technique would be enough to defend against the entire arsenal of a martial arts master. Soon he asked the maid if today was the annual exam. That was true, but she asked Dick to be careful, because the 8th prince had broken through to the small yellow stage. Then Dick told her in secret that he too had broken through to this stage, but he still had a lot of work to do. She promised to keep the secret, but asked Dick to be careful. Dick took her advice. Afterwards, she said that she would help the guy change into royal clothes. As they began preparing, the maid said that Dick's mother did not yet know that he would also be performing. And then she told Dick that he looked more like a prince than anyone else. Then Dick was ready to go to the royal arena. There were already a lot of people in the arena. The district king wondered if the 7th prince had returned yet. The queen said the prince had warned that he would not be able to return on time due to important business. But the king believed that if the 7th did not participate this year, then there was nothing to see. The queen then announced that the 9th prince would take part. The king asked why he was not informed immediately. Leah replied that since Dick had only just received his mark, it was not something the king should worry about. But the king was still glad about it and wanted to see Dick. The 8th prince said that everyone arrived on time, but Dick was late, as if he had become arrogant after receiving the mark. But then Dick walked into the room and asked if it was okay to say something like that behind someone's back. When his brothers saw the boy, they were furious, and Dick approached the king and showed his respect. Many were surprised to hear that Dick asked his brothers to show respect to the king. The 8th prince thought that this would cause Dick problems. When his son called him king, the man was offended. The queen was also outraged that Dick had renounced his father. Leah immediately fell to her knees and said that Dick must have misspoken. But the guy continued to say that a father should raise and teach his children, but for Dick's sake, he never did anything. Moreover, he never stood up for Dick's mother, and only she raised her son. Dick also reported that they were forced to move on a winter night. After listening to him, the man was stunned. At that moment, many bowed to the king and waited for his reaction. Suddenly he asked who gave the order to evict Leah and Dick. The 8th prince's mother was frightened and thought that she should never give away the queen. Then she bowed before the king and said that it was her order. The king asked if she had decided this herself, and then he said that if she takes full responsibility, he would continue to live in the side palace. At that moment, the 8th prince's mother became ill, and the boy said that she needed rest. The king decided to forgive Dick's behavior, and then asked if he would take part in the event. Having received a bold answer, the king was delighted at how his son had changed. Then everyone started to expect the annual exam. The hostess was asked why she decided to attend the ceremony this year. What she was really interested in was where the 9th prince got the money for resources. The old man announced that the first round would begin soon. The smallest slab weighed 100 pounds, and the largest 1,000. The princess lifted the first slab with ease. She was very strong for her age. The old man said that the princess received her mark at the age of 4. Rihanna performed next. When the round began, she cast a spell, and she was able to lift the slab with one hand, and then she threw it to the ground with a crash. People were delighted, because she could be called the genius of her family. The king became interested in a girl who could even compete with the princes. Upon learning that it was Rihanna, the king remembered that he and Dick had been close as children, and that he had even wanted to betroth them. But for some reason the engagement had fallen apart. But the queen said that given the girl's talent, the 9th prince was not worthy of her. When it was Dick's turn, the 8th prince mockingly asked the boy to be careful so that Dick would not be crushed by the stone. At that moment, they crossed paths with Rihanna. The girl stopped and said that he shouldn't have come here. Rihanna said he would only make a fool of himself. Dick told her that she was indeed gifted, but she shouldn't think of everyone else as trash. Rihanna tried to convince him otherwise because they had been friends as children, but Dick was stubborn. As Dick approached the first slab, there were murmurs of discontent, but the hostess was sure that the guy was capable of more. But suddenly Dick went to the largest slab. Everyone was surprised that he was going to lift her, but they thought that this would only disgrace Dick. The 8th prince believed that even after 30 years of training, Dick would not be able to lift her. However, Dick easily tossed her into the air, and then he hit with one hand. When the slab was above him, everyone thought it would crush the guy, but Dick caught her with one hand, and then he lowered it down next to him. Then everyone began to admire the prince and his family. The 8th prince and Rihanna couldn't believe it, but the mistress noticed that Dick's control of power was better than that of many masters. Watching this, Leah felt proud of her son. The king was also delighted and looked forward to Dick's further successes. Only the one who lifted the heaviest slab could participate in the second round. The 9th princess asked Dick to be careful at this stage. Mia said that she is Dick's main opponent, and then she chuckled that when the 8th tried to lift the heaviest slab, he injured his leg. Each person was given only 5 arrows to kill an animal and a horse. They could only take part in the third stage if they killed the beast. Rihanna jumped on her horse and said that now she could show off her strength. Mia warned Dick that she would go first, and Dick was glad that it was time for the main show. At some point he noticed a rabbit, and he decided that he had an excellent hunting target in front of him. But he came to his senses, because it wasn't worth wasting arrows on a rabbit. Then someone else fired. The brother asked Dick why he didn't even try to kill the beast. He believed that a man had to have the courage to do this. And then he left, asking Dick not to return empty-handed. Dick himself understood that he had to try. Then he followed the sound of bulls mooing. And among the bulls he noticed Mia. The girl told Dick that these bulls were already hers, and immediately shot at them. The animals did not have time to dodge her attack. After finishing with them, Mia asked what Dick thought about her power. But Dick noticed something in the water. Then he tried to warn his sister. But at that moment the bull had already jumped out at the girl. She turned to face the bull in horror, but she managed to jump and the horse was injured. Due to her haste, Mia was unable to land safely. But the bull was moving towards her again. The girl thought with horror that she would be trampled. But at that moment an arrow hit the bull. Seeing this, Mia was surprised, and then she looked at the one who shot. It was Dick, and he fired the arrow again. The second arrow hit him in the back of the head. Unable to survive this, the bull fell to the ground. Dick asked Mia if she was okay. Mia replied that if he hadn't reacted in time, she would have been in trouble, and then praised Dick's skills. The guy replied that everyone had strengths and weaknesses. Jumping onto Dick's horse, she asked him to move on. She will have to go with Dick, because her horse was seriously injured. She asked Dick to hurry before all the animals were taken. Dick was a little confused by her behavior, but he didn't object. Mia was still thrilled that Dick had been able to kill that bull, but suddenly Dick asked her not to move. Then they noticed a beast ahead. It was the strongest first-rank beast, the blue flame deer. Recognizing the beast, Mia asked what they should do. They only had 4 arrows left, so Dick wanted to start hunting, but Mia was frightened by this idea. Then Dick asked if she didn't want to kill such a beast. Dick knew that the beast's advantage was speed. He decided to provoke the beast. The deer became angry and roared, and then he rushed at Dick. But Dick jumped up and dodged his horns, and he wanted to attack the deer from above. When he did this, an explosion and a shockwave were created. Mia praised Dick for his work, but Dick said it was too early to rejoice. At that moment the deer was behind him. Turning around, Dick thought this was the right moment, and then he attacked the beast again. But his arm was slightly injured, causing Dick to feel some pain. Because of this, he decided to create distance. Dick felt that with such power, the deer deserved its reputation. Meanwhile, the deer looked menacingly at Dick, and without wasting any time, he rushed at the guy again. Mia noticed that the deer had forgotten about her. It was a great opportunity for her and she decided to attack. However, the deer shook its head and reflected the arrows. At that moment, he opened up to Dick, which made the guy happy. This allowed Dick to land a blow to the head, and Mia decided to continue shooting with a bow. At that moment, her arrow hit the deer right in the eye. Taking the arrow he had, Dick ran forward, and jumping, he was about to plunge it into the deer, and hit the deer in the withers. At that moment, the deer was enveloped in a bright light. Realizing that Dick had killed the deer, Mia was astonished, but Dick replied that they did it together. Then Mia hugged him and said that they were the best partners. Meanwhile, everyone was worried that the 9th prince and princess did not return. Due to Dick's absence, Leah began to worry. When her father asked Rihanna about her impressions, the girl replied that everything turned out to be easier than she thought. The girl was secretly glad that it seemed Dick had not been able to kill a single animal. But suddenly the crowd became alarmed. At that moment, Dick and Mia returned. Then the king asked for the results of the hunt to be announced. The man began to list those who participated, died, and dropped out. Meanwhile, Dick's brother told him that Dick's failure in the hunt could be considered more than just humiliating. Rihanna came in 7th place. Steve ended up in 3rd place and was surprised that he wasn't in 1st place. Finally, it was announced that Dick took 1st place. Hearing this, Dick chuckled contentedly. Everyone was surprised that Dick had achieved such great results in just 3 months, and the king was delighted that he would give Dick a reward, a heavy bow. But Dick explained that he had killed the strongest beast together with the 9th princess. Mia said she was in danger, but Dick helped her. The king was delighted with their friendship, but said that Dick would decide who would own the bow. Dick decided to give up the bow, as the sword suited him better. This gesture made Mia happy, and Dick replied that the girl deserved it. The girl decided not to give up the bow and wished Dick good luck. In the first match of the final, Mia was supposed to face Rihanna. Mia wanted to see her opponent in battle, and then she drew her blade. And using her best technique, she prepared to attack Rihanna. Rihanna reacted calmly to her actions. She calmly waited for the right moment, and when it came, she dispelled Mia's attack. At that moment, Mia swung again, and she decided to attack Rihanna several times in a row. However, she again calmly repelled all attacks. Dick noticed that the difference in their strength was too great. At that moment, the distance between Rihanna and Mia decreased. Rihanna prepared to attack, and Mia was able to block her blow with difficulty. However, their collision caused an explosion. But Rihanna said it wasn't over yet. Then Dick asked Mia to be careful. However, she was unable to block her opponent's attack. Realizing that this was the end, Rihanna stopped, and she told the girl that she lost the fight. Mia asked why she lost so quickly if she was not inferior in strength, but Dick replied that she would understand it later. Afterwards, the girl replied that Dick should be more careful with his opponent. Dick's opponent asked for a fist fight because he didn't know how to handle a sword. Everyone supported Dick's opponent and believed that the ninth prince would lose. After all, his opponent's family was famous for its hand-to-hand combat skills. The guy immediately decided to start the fight. Dick behaved calmly in front of him, and at the right moment he also began to conjure. They collided, causing a flash of light to appear in the middle of the arena. Mia immediately thought that the winner was determined. In fact, Dick easily stopped the guy's attack. This made him angry, and he even felt pain in his hand. Then Dick told him that the boy had lost. Jumping back, the boy asked the wild man how he could be so strong. Dick replied that his opponent was simply too weak. Because of this, the enemy experienced powerful pressure. The king was glad that the ninth prince never ceased to amaze everyone. Afterwards, the next participants were announced. Everyone immediately started discussing the upcoming fight between Dick and Rihanna. Mia chuckled that it would be a good show. And then she told Dick that Rihanna was looking straight at him. For a moment their eyes met. Mia couldn't wait for Dick to take revenge on Rihanna for her. Soon they entered the arena. Rihanna thought that today she could take advantage of Dick's crush. She said Dick's cultivation was amazing. And then she asked if they really needed to fight, because Dick knew how important it was for Rihanna to get into the top 4. Dick replied that it was important to him too, and said that he could fight Rihanna without using a sword. Rihanna immediately agreed, thanking the guy for his generosity, and immediately attacked Dick. But he was in no hurry to block her attack. Only at the last moment did he dodge the sword aimed at him. Ignoring this, Rihanna continued to fight. She struck again, but Dick jumped and avoided it. Rihanna's attack hit the ground and created a flash. At that moment, the attack almost reached Dick. But Rihanna realized it was an illusion, and the real Dick was behind her. She couldn't fight for long, so she decided to use her most powerful move. When she struck, Dick was able to dodge, and then he immediately created a distance between them. However, he was at the edge of the arena and could no longer dodge. Because of this, Dick decided to attack. But Rihanna thought it was stupid to try to defeat her with her bare hands. But at that moment, there was a big flash of light. Mia was surprised that Dick had hidden his power all this time. After attacking, Dick told Rihanna that she had lost. The powerful attack caused Rihanna's clothes to tear and blood to flow. Mia chuckled as Dick tore her clothes, and the king was surprised that the guy had such talent. Rihanna's father was surprised that his daughter was defeated with one blow. At that moment, the fight could be considered over. Dick told his sister that he had won. Rihanna refused to admit defeat and wanted to continue, but Dick decided to leave, saying that there was a huge difference between them. Rihanna told me not to look down on her because she still had an ace. Then she rose to her feet, and grabbing the sword, she rushed towards Dick. Seeing this, Mia tried to warn Dick about the danger. The others were also surprised that Rihanna was attacking from behind. The father also tried to stop Rihanna because her actions could harm their family. Rihanna attacked, but she missed. Instantly, Dick was behind her and ready to attack. Rihanna didn't have time to dodge his attack. She was terrified and thought that this was her end. At that moment, a flash of light appeared in the arena again. This caused Rihanna to receive even more damage. Dick just stood there and looked at his sister, who could no longer move. Her father was worried about her condition. Running up to his daughter, he thanked Dick for his mercy. However, Dick was furious. Meanwhile, Rihanna was planning to take revenge on Dick for today's humiliation. Soon, a duel between Dick and Sam was announced. After they were announced, the opponents entered the arena. Sam immediately offered Dick a sword fight. Without hesitation, Dick agreed. Then Mia threw her sword to Dick. Dick was surprised by such a powerful weapon, which moreover he could use. But Sam attacked, asking how Dick could look at a weapon in the middle of a fight. Even though it was a surprise attack, Dick dodged it. But Sam immediately followed him. And then he attacked Dick, and this time the guy couldn't dodge. Dick even got injured because of this attack. Mia knew Dick was cunning enough to be easily hurt. Dick told Sam that if he didn't fight with all his strength, he would lose. Sam turned around sharply and attacked again. He was angry that some loser underestimated him. But Dick said Sam should change tactics if the trick didn't work. At that moment, he repelled the attack. However, Sam refused to give up, so he continued to attack Dick. Meanwhile, Dick easily parried his blows. And then he was surprised that this was all that the young master of the master's mansion was capable of. Sam was angry that Dick was being too arrogant. He delivered a powerful blow, hoping that the Dick would not be able to cope with it. But Dick dodged the attack and jumped back. Because of this, A distance arose between them. Then Sam realized that Dick was deliberately making him waste his energy. And when Sam got tired, Dick decided to start attacking. As his attack began, a lot of light appeared around, and while Sam was confused, Dick rushed towards him. At the last moment, the guy managed to expose his weapon to the blow, but Dick was able to break his weapon and wound Sam. Bleeding profusely, Sam admitted defeat. Blood gushed from his wound and his broken sword sank into the ground. The audience was surprised that Dick defeated the master of the yellow area so easily. Seeing Dick's skill, Rihanna assumed that they bought that book from him. The old man was impressed, but he knew Dick had no chance in the next round. Then the woman answered him that Dick was a genius, and such people were capable of performing miracles. When Steve met Dick, he said he was surprised when he didn't take first place in the hunt, but now he was going to defeat Dick and regain his glory. But Dick suggested that the guy could only lose more of his glory. Steve got tired of talking and rushed into battle. Dick immediately noticed that the guy was fast. At that moment, the enemy blade almost reached him, but he escaped. Steve was a little surprised by this, but then Dick was in over his head, and while attacking, he said that this is called a tactical retreat. When he attacked, Steve was able to block the blow, and he asked if these were all Dick's abilities. Dick was surprised that Steve was able to block his attack so easily, and then Steve was able to push Dick away from himself. He then decided to make a powerful attack, challenging Dick to withstand it. At that moment, he summoned the red flame snake spirit. Dick understood that if he didn't dodge, he would get seriously injured. But at that moment the snake was already preparing to swallow the guy, and Dick was forced to use the technique he had been saving, and he allowed Steve's spell to be broken. Spectators were surprised that Dick was able to survive such a powerful attack, and Leah, watching the fight, was worried about Dick. But Mia asked her not to worry, because Dick was strong. Avoiding the powerful attack, Dick landed on the ground. He told Steve that he couldn't beat him at half strength. After listening to Dick, Steve agreed to show him his true power, and swinging his weapon, he prepared to attack. Noticing Steve attacking, Dick tensed a little, but having time to react, he exposed his sword to the blow. And at that moment, a white light began to emanate from the sword. He swung it, filling everything around with blue mana. Steve also reacted quickly and dodged this attack, and Dick continued to provoke him, saying that after his loud words, Steve turned out to be weak. Having finished speaking, he rushed at his opponent, but Steve told Dick that he wouldn't be able to use his powers in the air, and then he was going to demonstrate to Dick the advantage of his long spear. They began to fight in the air, constantly attacking and harassing each other. At some point, Steve got injured, and it offended him so much that he was ready to kill Dick. After that, he launched a powerful attack. Dick then agreed that he couldn't use his powers in the air, but now Steve was a living target for him. But Steve took his words as a simple mockery. Dick landed on the ground, and Steve was still in the air and about to attack. Dick admitted that he was waiting for Steve to fight him at full strength, and he had to use a move to block Steve's blow. Seeing Steve's power, the girls were worried whether Dick would survive, and the old man couldn't believe the potential that Dick had. The woman told him that perhaps Dick would receive more attention in the future, and then she wondered how else Dick could surprise her. Dick found further fighting pointless. He was sure that Steve already felt the difference between them. Dick suggested that he give up, since there was no point in Steve continuing. But Steve didn't want to listen to him and wanted to continue the fight. At that moment he attacked Dick, but the guy easily blocked the attack, and then he told Steve to blame only himself for what happened. Suddenly he approached the enemy, and with a slight movement he knocked the weapon out of his hands, simultaneously leaving a wound. Blood began to ooze from the wound on Steve's arm. But even after that, he refused to admit defeat. Having lost his weapon, he climbed on Dick with bare hands. Then Dick used one of his techniques, the elephant gallop. With her help, he easily stopped Steve's fist. The guy was surprised by the power that emanated from Dick. Then Dick announced that this was the last attack. At the same moment, several blades were pointed at Steve. Only when Dick left a wound on Steve's chest did the boy admit defeat. And then he collapsed to the ground, exhausted. Everyone was delighted that another genius had appeared in the royal family. Leah was proud of her son. Everything was as the hostess expected, so she asked to keep an eye on Dick. The king was delighted with his son, and ordered that the armor of the fire ice unicorn be given to him. But one of the brothers said that the greater the talent, the shorter the life. After all, the queen will not allow Dick to live long. Dick was informed that in order to enter the pond beneath the ancestral hall, he must bow to the emperors. At that moment, Dick's gaze fell on the statue of Sarah. The others immediately began to pay homage to her. But the man was outraged that Dick did not bow to her. Then Dick replied that he would bow his head only to heaven and his mother. After all, he was going to take revenge on Sarah. Steve thought that Dick's unruly nature would get him into trouble. Soon they came to the pond of the merciless god. They were told that they had to go down there and start their training. They were asked to stop training if they felt they were unable to cope. Dick understood that this was his first step on the path to revenge. Rihanna decided to go first, because she had the opportunity to surpass Dick. Thinking about this, she stepped into the water. Feeling the incredible power, the girl was surprised that if you thoughtlessly jump into the water, you will simply die. But in the meantime, Dick had already gone deep into the water. Smiling, Rihanna thought that he alone would be to blame for his death. 3 days later, Dick continued to improve. But the rest did it not in the water, but on land. The man was surprised that Dick lasted in the pond longer than the 7th prince. Dick's physical abilities had already increased, and he decided to return to the middle field of the yellow area. And since he was able to increase his strength, he will probably be able to open that scroll. Then he tried to open it again. But even now Dick found it hard to open, as if the scroll weighed several hundred pounds. The guy tried his best to open it, and I even got a little angry that the scroll didn't open. But in the end he was able to open it, and he was amazed by what he saw in it. Suddenly someone told Dick that there was a sacred tree. Dick immediately asked who was talking to him, and it turns out that the emperor, who was imprisoned in a scroll, spoke to him. Dick could free him, but he didn't understand why he should. The emperor replied that he could teach Dick the secret code of space and time. And then he found information about this in a scroll. And if Dick studies this, he will be able to open a small space. The emperor again asked to be released, and then he would train Dick. Dick wasn't sure it was wise to release the emperor, but he asked what he should do. To do this, Dick needed to pour his blood into the scroll so that it would recognize its owner. And since Dick was the owner of the scroll, he could rescue the emperor. After listening to the instructions, Dick did everything as required. Then light began to emanate from the scroll. From the scroll came the joyful voice of the emperor, because after 100,000 years he was finally free. At that moment he found himself in front of Dick, and he immediately decided to attack Dick in order to crush the guy. But Dick reacted quickly and easily threw the cat away from himself. Because of this, he flew back and hit the wall. He then took out his sword, and the emperor said that he was just checking Dick's cultivation. But ignoring this, Dick still hit him on the head, and he said that he would not believe his words. Having received another blow, the cat flew back again. Dick struck him with his sword several times, but noticed that there were no wounds left on the cat. The emperor said that his body was invulnerable, so he proposed a truce. But in that case, Dick wanted to send the cat back. The emperor desperately did not want to return there. However, Dick didn't care and locked the cat up again. He could return the cat to the scroll just by thinking about it. For now, Dick decided to leave it there, since he didn't have time for it. The Inscription Guild was one of the most powerful organizations in their kingdom, and that's where Dick decided to head. However, someone was following them, and the assassins decided to kill Dick when there were few people around. Dick asked the maid to wait while he went out to buy something. Afterwards, he headed alone to the Inscription Guild. The 8th prince was surprised to see Dick here, but Dick didn't even talk to him and walked past. Suddenly, Mira said that she came here to show her respect to Dick and the guild. However, the prince grabbed her hand, and he said that Mira should stay away from people like Dick. But Mira refused to listen to this, because Dick was young and talented. The prince couldn't believe that the girl stood up for Dick. Mira continued that there is a difference between men and women, so it is worth behaving decently, and then she rushed to catch up with Dick. The girl offered to help him learn the script, and Dick thought it might be useful to him. The prince became angry and told Dick that he would regret it. And then suddenly he noticed Dick's cart, and he decided that he had found a way to get even with the guy. Approaching the maid, the prince ordered her to take him to the palace. The maid objected that it was the 9th prince's carriage. The boy became angry and replied that they were both princes, and he hit the girl because she did not obey his orders. And then he repeated his order, threatening that if she disobeyed, her family would have problems. Then the maid did not dare to object. Holding her sore cheek, she carried the prince to the palace. The prince decided that if he took the maid hostage, he could blackmail Dick. And when he became a martial arts master, he was going to kill Dick. Meanwhile, the assassins continued to watch. The assassins were already looking forward to getting to the prince. When there was no one around, they decided to attack. The arrow immediately flew into the carriage, and piercing it, it hit the 8th prince straight in the chest. Then they suddenly came up behind him and decided to finish what they had started. Hearing strange sounds, the maid tensed up. She immediately decided to check if the prince was okay. But when she asked the question, the prince did not answer her. Then the girl carefully looked inside, and what she saw frightened her. Because of the assassin's mistake, they decided to kill them. Their leader was angry that because of the noise they had made, they would no longer have the opportunity to kill the 9th. Then the girl decided to return to the queen and report everything. Meanwhile, Dick and Mira continued to talk about cultivation. But noticing that his carriage was missing, Dick became wary. At that moment, a horseman rode up to them. Dick tensed even more when he saw a member of the royal guard in front of him. Dick was informed that the 8th prince had just died, and the king wanted to see Dick in the palace. Mira was horrified, because they had seen each other just recently, and Dick hoped that his maid was not harmed and was not connected in any way with the 8th prince. When the king learned of the prince's death, he was furious. He was informed that the prince may have been killed by the moon demon cult in order to test the power of their district. But someone objected that the cult could not be involved in this. Dick said that since the prince was killed in his carriage, Dick must have been the target. The king agreed that if the cult had wanted to provoke them, they would have come up with something better. A month later, Dick was still continuing his training. In his past life, he failed to open only 3 meridians. If the master can open the chakra meridian, then every year a ring will appear on his body. The blood spirit meridian was associated with blood. The soul meridian connected the physical body with the soul, and allowed one to leave the body and travel with the soul. Although little was known about them, Dick believed that he could open the chakra meridian. Suddenly the cat said that he would help to help, and if Dick let him out, then this time he would not lie. Dick immediately decided to get the scroll, and he immediately released the cat. He immediately told the cat to tell something useful, otherwise he would never leave the scroll. Trembling, the cat said that the answer was in Dick's hands. If Dick imagines himself as a tree that creates new rings every year, he will be able to cultivate chakra. It worked, and the cat was surprised that Dick was able to open the chakra. Afterwards, the cat asked to be taken to the store to buy a stove, and then he would teach Dick how to create a space ring. Dick warned that if the cat tried to escape, Dick would lock him up again. And then he thought that he didn't have money to buy a stove. Suddenly the cat said that if Dick creates rings and sells them, he will become rich. But suddenly Dick grabbed him. The cat was indignant because he was not a pet, but the king of the earth. Soon they went to buy a stove. Dick immediately attracted people's attention because he was traveling in the company of 2 beauties. Chuck was interested in Dick, but he was more concerned that Mira was next to him. But since he had a good position in the city, he decided that he could easily get any girl. And after that he decided to jump out right in front of Dick. Seeing the guy's idiotic appearance, Dick immediately thought that he was from a rich family. Chuck immediately turned to Mira, and he invited her to take a walk around the city. But she refused, because they were heading to the martial arts arena. Since he was the master of the city and the palace belonged to him, Chuck decided to join them. Chuck was a famous person, and Dick became curious about what he was like. Soon they arrived at the arena. Chuck said that if Dick wanted to fight, he would have to sign a life and death certificate first. Dick didn't understand why all the royal families were foul-mouthed. Soon they began watching the fights. Having approached the enemy from behind, the guy was about to strike, and he cut off his head with a fan. Earlier, the guy asked his opponent to admit defeat, but he did not agree. Seeing the guy's strength, Mira asked if Dick really wanted to participate. Mia also began to worry about Dick, but he asked her not to worry. When Dick entered the arena, everyone thought he was a typical glory seeker. Chuck was glad that if Dick died in the arena, it would save him some problems. Harley introduced himself to Dick and asked him to draw his sword. But Dick said he was afraid that if he drew his sword he would seriously injure the boy. This arrogance immediately angered Harley, and in a rage he rushed at Dick. Dick calmly said that Harley was not worthy, and then with a light blow he was able to push the guy away. Dropping his spear, Harley fell to the ground. Turning around, Dick asked him to admit it, and Harley thanked Dick for sparing him. At that moment, many people became interested in Dick. Chuck was surprised, because he didn't expect Dick to be the center of attention. Dick's companions admired him and believed that he was unpredictable. At that moment, a new opponent came out to Dick. But Dick dealt with him easily too. He also defeated the next one with his bare hands. And he was able to knock out another one with a kick. Everyone was surprised that Dick won by just 1 stroke. Meanwhile, the guy with the fan watched and realized that Dick must have reached the stage of the sword following the heart. Dick's fights continued. Mia was surprised that Dick defeated the master of the yellow area with 1 blow. Mira assumed that Dick had already broken through to a higher area. Chuck was angry that Dick was so strong and asked to bring the half-orc. Dick's next opponent was a woman who immediately apologized if she hurt Dick in any way, and after that she immediately attacked. But Dick dodged and became interested in her fighting style. Then he began to maneuver, dodging her whip, and suddenly he found himself right next to his rival. And then he lightly touched her hand with his fingers. At that moment, the woman experienced severe pain. She dropped the whip and Dick asked her to surrender. Realizing that he was not her equal, the woman thanked Dick for his mercy. Suddenly the guy said that he would put an end to Dick's winning streak. And then he jumped from the spectator area to the arena. Dick immediately recognized the guy with the fan. Bill introduced himself to Dick and greeted the prince. But Dick thought that Bill was very similar to Harley, because he looked just as stupid. Bill advised Dick to draw his sword. Dick replied that this would only happen if Bill's strength proved worthy. Bill replied that then Dick should be careful. Bill had previously killed 9 masters and hoped that Dick would not become the 10th. Dick chuckled that Bill had come just for this, and then blocked his attack. Dick immediately decided that Bill was worthy, and he would have to draw his sword, and Bill asked them to stop talking nonsense and attacking him. They fought evenly, so Chuck couldn't predict the winner. At that moment, a half-orc arrived to him. Chuck said that if Bill lost, the orc would enter the arena and kill Dick. The orc replied that he would not let Chuck down. At that moment, the battle continued. With a swing of his sword, Dick destroyed Bill's shadow. Because of this, the boy realized that Dick was much stronger. Dick said Bill had no time to relax and came up behind him. And then he prepared to attack. Due to surprise and his own inattention, Bill was unable to dodge. After this, he was defeated. Mia was surprised that she was worried about a wolf in sheep's clothing. Mira was surprised that Dick did not leave the arena and wanted to continue fighting. Suddenly, Dick felt someone else's strong aura. At that moment, the orc was already attacking him. But Dick reacted and managed to dodge. The orc was glad that he had come across a strong opponent. Mia and Mira recognized that orc, so they were horrified. And because two beauties were worried about Dick, the orc wanted to kill the guy even more. When the orc attacked, Dick was able to block the blow. He didn't understand how this orc could have so much power. When the moment arose, Dick decided to create distance. Mia advised Dick to admit defeat, because he couldn't handle the orc. Mira also said that the orc was Chuck's servant and would definitely kill Dick. The orc said that if Dick did not listen to their advice, he would be cut in half. Chuck said that if Dick was afraid of death, he better admit defeat. But Dick decided to continue fighting, because he didn't yet know what the orc was capable of. Such stubbornness angered Chuck, and he continued to convince Dick that he had lost. Meanwhile, the orc advised Dick to enjoy his last moments. But Dick offered to show the orc what fear was. After his words, the orc struck. But Dick easily blocked the blow and began to provoke his opponent. The orc replied that if Dick so strongly desired to die, it could be arranged. At that moment, a light appeared in the arena. Mia was worried about Dick because she couldn't see the arena. Dick continued to say that the orc was an unworthy weakling, and because of this, he disappointed Dick. Having finished speaking, he struck. But this only angered the orc a little. Then Dick launched a more powerful attack. After that, the first wound appeared on the orc's torso. But Dick decided not to stop and find out how many sword blows the orc could withstand. And then he began to attack quickly. The orc groaned in pain. However, he continued to stand on his feet. Turning around, he praised the guy for being able to inflict a serious wound. But because of this, he decided to send Dick straight to hell. The orc's eyes blazed with a furious fire and everything around him was illuminated by a flash. Then he gripped his weapon tightly, and he swung and threw it at Dick. Dick immediately noticed that the force of the orc's blows had increased sharply. In an attempt to defend himself from the attack, he created a shield. But the orc immediately caught up with the guy, and he struck his shield with all his might. Dick said that if the orc wanted to kill him, he would have to destroy this defense. Orc admitted that Dick's pace was driving him crazy, and then he began to furiously attack the shield from all sides. Soon after this, he became exhausted, but the shield was still intact. This angered the orc a little, but then he decided to increase his strength. Dick was interested in the fact that the orc could enter berserker mode. The spectators were amazed that the orc seemed to have gone crazy. Mia was worried about Dick, and again advised him to admit defeat. Chuck chuckled that if Dick lost, only death awaited him. The orc emanated enormous power. He took a swing and decided to attack Dick. Because of this, an explosion began to form. Dick waited for the orc to destroy his shield so he could attack himself. And when the shield was broken, Mia was horrified. However, at that very moment, Dick rushed at his opponent. And having struck, he rushed past the berserker. The orc was surprised that some kid had defeated him in berserker mode, and then he collapsed to the ground. The spectators were surprised that even the orc fell at the feet of the 9th prince, and Mia and Mira rejoiced at Dick's victory. But suddenly they came to their senses and pulled away from each other. Unlike them, Chuck was angry that the orc couldn't kill the one who had been a loser all these years. Dick only needed to win once to become the master of the yellow area. Suddenly Dick's opponent was behind him. When the enemy struck, Dick managed to jump back. The guy said that Dick was a real genius, but Chuck believed that Dick couldn't handle him. Dick wanted to end the fight quickly, because unlike him, Chuck was full of strength. Chuck said he wouldn't stop until he put Dick in the ground. Having finished speaking, he rushed forward, but Dick was able to confidently block his attack. Chuck was disappointed that Dick had defeated the orc, so he wanted to finish it quickly. At that moment, their collision created a shockwave. Taking advantage of the moment, Dick jumped away from Chuck. Chuck said he was as good with a sword as Dick. Then he used the meteorite sword technique. Dick realized that he would not be able to dodge all the swords. Because of this, he decided to use the eye meridians. Dick thought that this way he could easily dodge the sword, and he managed to do it. But Chuck was angered by his arrogance. He continued to attack, and the attack became much faster. But despite this, Dick was able to dodge her. and instantly approached Chuck. But Chuck believed that because of this, Dick would not be able to dodge the attack with a long range and attacked. At that moment, Dick sensed danger, and he was instantly swallowed up by Chuck's attack. The arena was filled with smoke and nothing could be seen. Then Mia became worried about Dick, and Chuck asked if Mira really wanted to follow the one who lost the fight. But Dick thanked Chuck for raising the dust, because now he wouldn't be able to catch Dick. Suddenly something quickly approached Chuck. It turned out it was Dick. He then tried to attack, but Chuck dodged the attack. Despite this, a cut remained on his neck. Chuck, enraged, swung, and he tried to attack Dick, but he ducked in time. And in Chuck's second attack, he put his sword under it. Enraged, Chuck yelled at Dick to go to hell, but Dick stepped back a little. Then Chuck noticed that Dick's strength was running out, but Dick replied that the same could be said about Chuck. Chuck was offended by this, because he was a powerful genius. But Dick provoked him, saying that this barking only made him look more like a dog. Then Chuck decided to deal with Dick right away, because there was no more time for him. Dick decided to block the blow with his own attack. At first their attacks clashed, and a moment later, an explosion occurred. Mira said that even high-level yellow area duels weren't that destructive. Meanwhile, the duel continued. Suddenly Chuck was able to strip Dick of his weapon, and he grinned, asking how Dick would fight now. But suddenly I noticed something. Dick could fight him without using weapons, and this attack caught Chuck by surprise. After this, it was even difficult for him to stand on his feet, so Dick believed that victory was his. Mia was glad that Dick reached the yellow area so quickly. Meanwhile, someone thought that Dick would surpass the seventh prince due to his unpredictable strength. The man replied that when that time came, they would help the ninth prince, and at best, both princes would suffer. Soon Dick was congratulated on his victory and given the money prince. Dick thought it was stupid that the masters would fight to the death for this stupid map. Suddenly he saw someone running towards him. Dick was surprised when he saw them. Mia and Mira were happy about his victory, but Dick admitted that he felt cramped and had trouble breathing. Other girls said that geniuses were always surrounded by beauties. Mia envied Dick, because now he could get into the barbarian god's pond again. Hearing this, Dick was delighted and wanted to return to the palace. That same evening the king inquired about Dick's progress. He praised Dick, but asked him to hide his meridians. And then he handed him a fourth-grade pill and said that Dick should take it when he entered the pond. But if he fails to manage his cultivation, he will be expelled. Meanwhile, the queen was furious. She didn't want to let Dick get any stronger. The maid asked what she meant. The queen replied that she wanted the prince's head this month, no matter what the cost. But the girl asked what would happen if the prince left the palace. The queen repeated that she wanted his head, no matter the cost. She was going to nip Dick in the bud. Meanwhile, Leah's family wanted to let go of what happened 3 years ago. The father asked his sons to apologize to her, because after all, they were family. The brothers looked at each other in surprise. Then the old man asked them what had happened. The second son admitted that a couple of months ago, Leah tried to improve the relationship, but her older brother humiliated her and drove her away. The third son agreed that his older brother had gone too far. Angered, the father said that his eldest son would go with him and apologize to Leah. He replied that for him, as the head of the family, asking for forgiveness would be too humiliating. The old man asked him if he understood that his stubbornness would destroy the future of their family. Suddenly someone asked why they should apologize. Then Carl was asked why he came back. The seventh prince's servant replied that the prince had sent him here to sort out a couple of problems. The old man was surprised that Carl was sent here to get rid of the seventh prince. Carl replied that if the prince wanted it that way, then so it would be. And he warned the old man not to take the wrong side, otherwise their family would suffer. This made the man angry. Finally, Carl said that the master agreed to take Leah as a concubine. At that moment, the two brothers thought that for now, the old man would not be angry with them. Afterwards, the old man asked how things were going with Rihanna's engagement. The man replied that it was the wish of the seventh prince and Rihanna. Then the old man replied that their family had begun to serve the seventh prince more. Meanwhile, Dick continued his cultivation. It took him 7 days to completely clear the pill. Exhaling heavily, Dick concentrated on the process. After all, the power of the blood in the pond can help him better understand the meridian of the blood, spirit, and soul. 10 days later, Dick's cultivation continued. During this time, mana formed around him. Finally, he was able to reach the absolute yellow region and opened 36 meridians. At this, Dick laughed, and then his body made a breakthrough. Having reached the soul meridian, Dick found it incredible. The cat couldn't believe Dick had made this breakthrough. And then he thought that given Dick's strength, he had a fighting soul. In addition, Dick had a valuable space-time spirit, which would eventually be able to use its power in battle with the enemy. And through long-term cultivation, Dick will be able to get closer to that person. After some time, Dick continued to train. Mia was surprised that he was still practicing his palm technique. And then she reported that she heard that Rihanna was engaged to the 7th prince. But Dick said it had nothing to do with him and suggested going to the arena. Mia was surprised that he was proposing again, even though he had been cultivating in the pond for almost a month before. But Dick replied that it happened by accident. Then Rihanna grabbed his hand, and she asked Dick to go with her and open her eyes, because she was a real mediocrity. Dick had to cover his face because he became very popular after his appearance in the arena. But at that moment Dick was already being watched. Everyone has already heard about the appearance of the killer who cut off the heads of his opponents. Dick said he would like to learn something from such a person. The killer was the swordsman Locke. Looking at the guy, Dick immediately drew conclusions about his strength. When his opponent appeared in front of Locke, he chuckled that it was another one tired of life. But the half-orc said that he could easily deal with Locke. Before he could react, Locke had already struck. Dick was surprised by the swordsman's speed. And in fact, Dick doubted whether he could stand up to him. Mia replied that having a brother like him was truly incredible. At that moment Dick was called out by Carl, and he said that he missed Dick. Dick replied, calling him his devilish cousin, that they had indeed not seen each other for a long time. But Carl was outraged that Dick laughed at his shortcomings. Viewers were surprised that Locke had killed 10 people in a row over the course of the show. Afterwards, Locke shouted that he had fulfilled his promise by winning 10 times in a row. Rihanna replied that with his abilities, all doors were open to him. And the guy replied that all he wanted was to stay close to her. However, if Locke hadn't been useful to her, Rihanna wouldn't have even allowed him to talk to her. When Dick was about to go to the arena, Mia asked him to be careful. Rihanna didn't understand why Dick came here if he had already become the master of the yellow area. Carl said that if Locke killed the prince right in the arena, it would only play into his hands. At that moment, Dick was already in the arena. When people recognized him, they immediately made a fuss. Chuck said Dick was just lucky to beat him last time. But this time everything was different. Dick replied that if Chuck wanted to be first so badly, then let him attack. But Chuck was surprised that Dick wanted to fight without a sword, and the guy was offended that Dick looked down on him. And then he attacked the guy, but Dick was calm even without a weapon. Their collision caused an explosion, but Dick's attack was so powerful that Chuck felt pain. He dropped the weapon and grabbed his hand. Dick said that Chuck was no longer his opponent. Then Chuck asked when Dick had become so strong. But Dick only asked why Chuck made a fool of himself if he had a good life. Dick's provocation worked instantly. Chuck tried to attack Dick again, but he was calm. Dick turned around sharply and was ready to kick Chuck. The blonde didn't react and was hit in the face. Mia said her brother had a good hit, but Rihanna was angry that the girl was making fun of her. Meanwhile, Chuck was finally defeated, but he promised Dick that he would train and would definitely surpass him. Dick replied that Chuck was different from other rich kids and would wait for Chuck to call. Dick also won the next fight, and after that he fought with the girl, but he defeated her too. After this, Dick's streak of victories continued. The audience was delighted with his level of skill, and the girls admired him and wanted to marry him. Mia was surprised that Dick had previously been a loser, but now everyone was praising him. Rihanna was angry that Dick was stealing all the attention again. Since Dick insulted her, she asked Locke to kill the prince, and he immediately agreed. The duel between them was about to begin, and Locke said that he had to take Dick's life. Dick replied that there was a fatal flaw in Locke's swordplay, so the boy had better retreat. But Locke said they would only find out by fighting each other. Dick continued that Locke was using a sword technique that was damaging his body. Locke replied that since Dick knew about his technique, he should understand what it was capable of. Locke's technique was incomplete, so Dick wanted to see what Locke was capable of. Rihanna got tired of talking and asked Locke to start. Locke immediately rushed into battle. Dick opened his meridian eyes and immediately blocked the blow. Both opponents took each other seriously. Soon they rose into the sky and fought there. Dick thought this fight would help him improve his reaction time. But Locke was irritated by the fact that Dick was thinking about something during the fight. The spectators were delighted with the fight, although they could not follow the masters and saw only their shadows. Rihanna was thrilled that Dick was going to die soon. But in the meantime, Dick asked Locke to admit his defeat. But the guy didn't understand why an ordinary person thought he could be stronger. Dick replied that if Locke had powerful moves, he should use them. Then the guy was enveloped in a dark aura. His body began to change and he grinned. Mia warned Dick that if he didn't end the fight quickly, he would be in trouble. But Dick replied that he had been waiting for this moment. At that moment, Locke awakened his wolf blood, and he grinned at the fact that he now had the upper hand. Rihanna said that if Dick hadn't humiliated her then, he wouldn't be suffering now. Meanwhile, Dick told Locke that he was a worthy opponent, but Locke replied that this chatter was useless. And then he rushed towards Dick, but suddenly he moved behind Dick's back. He couldn't dodge, so he created a shield. A powerful attack hit Dick's shield, but he couldn't withstand this attack and cracked. Locke noted that since the shield was broken, Dick would not be able to hide. However, Dick had no intention of doing this. He grabbed Locke's hand, and then he struck him with a sword. Because his movements were restricted, Locke was unable to dodge. Mia hoped that this was the end, and Rihanna was outraged that even Locke lost. The audience was surprised that the 9th prince defeated Locke so easily. Locke asked why Dick didn't kill him, but Dick never killed and had no intention of doing so. Now Locke owed him his life and intended to repay him in the future, but Rihanna ordered his arms and legs to be broken. She was furious that he was unable to kill Dick. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. Because of this, she ordered the guy to be killed. At that moment, Locke noticed that he was under attack. Locke tried to stop Rihanna, but it was no use. He was ready to give his life for her, but she didn't care. Mia and Dick soon found him, and Dick refused to abandon the boy. He believed that now it was only up to Locke whether he would live or not. After all, it was precisely because of his will to live that he himself was able to return to this world. Soon the assassin found the 9th prince's carriage, and immediately decided to attack him. Without hesitation, she struck immediately, and his power destroyed the cart. However, it turned out that Dick was able to escape. But hearing someone's voice, she turned around. Dick said it was an honor to see the Black Area killer. At that moment, someone was also approaching from the front. Mia said they weren't going to kill her, just find out who hired her. The girl was outraged that 2 children said they would spare her. Sensing something was wrong, Dick tried to warn Mia. At that moment, the assassin had already attacked her, but Mia could easily defend herself from such an attack. The woman told her that Mia was not worthy of being fought seriously. Immediately after this, Mia tried to warn Dick about the danger. At that moment, the assassin was approaching him. She attacked Dick, but he easily blocked the blow. And then he said that the Black Area expert was more furious than the Yellow Area expert. But this outraged the woman a little. Suddenly her sword wrapped around Dick's arm. Then Dick fell to the ground. Mia was worried about Dick and asked the heavens to save her brother. At that moment, the girl was about to pierce the Wild One with her claw. He noticed it right away. That's why he was able to attack before the assassin. The assassin recoiled in pain, and Dick asked to send someone stronger next time. Afterwards, he hit the girl again, saying that at her level she was not his opponent. Then he grabbed her leg. The woman didn't understand why Dick was so strong in the Yellow Area. Afterwards, she took Dick's attack on herself again. Mia thought that there was no need to be so cruel to a woman, but Dick replied that gender didn't matter, because he was a killer. At that moment, the woman could no longer move. Afterwards, Dick asked again who hired her. Without answering, she stood up abruptly. She tried to attack Dick, but he dodged. She wanted to escape from here since the assassination of the prince failed, and after this thought, she jumped onto the roof. The prince turned out to be stronger than they thought, so she was going to report this to the queen. But Dick caught up with her and said that she was not very fast. Then a fight broke out between them on the rooftops. Dick was fast and resilient. Because of this, the woman was worried that he would catch her. Then she decided to take out her hidden weapon. However, Dick noticed him immediately. At that moment, the blades were already flying at him. Reacting quickly, Dick was able to repel them. Because of this, the woman thought that she would not be able to escape. Dick said she wasn't the only one with a hidden weapon. After that, he attacked her. The woman was unable to dodge and was injured. When she received the blow, she only had time to notice it. After that, she fell to the ground. Dick immediately approached her. Dick was interested to know who the man was who wanted to kill him. So he decided to remove the assassin's mask, but the woman decided to attack him again. She instantly jumped down and approached him. But Dick was more agile and hit her. The woman immediately flew away from him several meters. Then Dick decided that he would have to force the information out of her. The woman only said that she had sacrificed a lot for this mission, so she would not let Dick know anything. Dick immediately noticed that the woman had figured something out. After this, smoke began to come from her body. She failed to kill him, but someone will definitely come for him in the future. That was the last thing Dick heard from her. When Mia asked what happened to the assassin, Dick replied that the woman was dead. Now Dick became curious about who gave the assassin such a pill. Now Dick had a plan to lure the snake out of its lair. The queen soon realized that something had happened. Soon they came to her with bad news. She didn't understand what the panic was about, and demanded to be told everything as it was. The maid reported that the assassin had failed to kill the prince and had ended up in prison, and Dick had seen her face. The queen began to worry, because that woman was her servant, whom the king knew. The queen asked the maid to rescue the assassin by any means necessary. The maid repeated that the prince saw the assassin's face. The queen replied that she would send 2 more assassins after him, and she asked the maid not to disappoint her. The maid replied to the queen that she would never disappoint her. The next day, the queen decided to put the responsibility for Rihanna's wedding with the prince on Charles. Rihanna and Carl immediately agreed to this. Soon the queen was informed that her 3 students had been caught by the guards and had swallowed poison pills. Carl was surprised to hear this. Only then did the queen realize that she had underestimated Dick. She knew that if she didn't get rid of the Dick, he would become a big problem. Carl suggested hiring black market assassins. The queen agreed and left it to Charles, and Carl simply asked to provide this to his servants. Mia soon reported that everyone who tried to kill Mark had died. Dick already guessed that the queen was behind it all. Mia asked if Dick would like to see Locke. Dick immediately wanted to go to the guy after learning that he had woken up. The maid reported to Dick that Locke had come to, but he looked lost. Dick replied that the guy could only heal his emotional wounds himself. The maid took him to Locke and said that the boy had been drawing someone's face all day. Mia didn't want to believe that the guy was drawing Rihanna, but it was her drawing. Dick asked Locke where his sword was. The boy replied indifferently that his meridians were destroyed, and he could no longer fight. But Dick was surprised at what Locke had become because of some girl. At that moment, Locke's hand froze. Locke replied that if Dick had not helped him twice, the boy would have already killed the prince. But Dick replied that Locke could never compare to him. This angered Locke. Then he tried to attack Dick with a stick. Dick attacked first and admitted that he didn't understand why he saved such trash. This only made Locke even more angry. He rushed at Dick again, but he didn't have time to react to the guy's attack. After that, he continued to receive blows from Dick. Dick said Locke didn't have the strength to even respond. The maid was worried that the prince's methods were too cruel. But Mia replied that Dick was just trying to bring Locke back to his senses. Half an hour later, Locke wanted to stop. Dick asked if he wanted to remain trash any longer. But Locke replied that he was a swordsman. Then Dick asked the guy what he was going to do next. As he stood up, Locke said he needed medication to restore his meridians. Suddenly, Dick said that he had a technique that could only be used by a person with destroyed meridians. Hearing this, Locke was delighted with such good fortune. By handing over the equipment, Dick allowed it to be used. Afterwards, Mia wanted to go with Dick to the royal arena. That same evening, the king was offered to send the prince on an internship. The king agreed that with his success, Dick could be recruited into the sect. And he remembered that someone wanted to recommend Dick to the training palace so that he could practice cultivation. But only a few could get into the educational palace. But the king was confident that Dick would be able to get there. Soon Mia and Dick arrived at the arena. The family that owned this place had many geniuses, so Dick was impressed. Mia was surprised that Dick was able to be shocked by this place. Dick replied that although he was a prince, he had rarely been anywhere, unlike his sister, who had a strange outfit. But Mia found the clothes functional and stylish. At that moment, the sixth prince approached them. Hearing him, Dick immediately turned around. The fifth prince was also with him, wanting to see Dick's fighting prowess. And the third brother wanted to teach Dick a lesson and asked him to demonstrate his potential to everyone. However, there was a big difference between them, which did not suit Mia. Dick noticed that out of the whole family, only Mia perceived him as part of her family. But the third believed that the defeat from his older brother would be a lesson for Dick. Carl thought that the prince was speaking correctly, and he asked Dick if he wanted to accept the challenge because he was afraid of losing. Charles was here because the queen had given him permission to practice here along with the others. But Mia replied that some people would not become a phoenix even if they had the opportunity. This phrase greatly offended Rihanna. Then the third prince asked Dick again if they would fight, and Dick accepted his challenge. Then the prince said that he hoped Dick would not lose after the first blow. Rihanna was surprised that Dick agreed and didn't want to miss such a show. Soon they were in the arena. The third prince fought without weapons. Dick was surprised that they wanted to suppress him with pure force. When he was attacked, he managed to dodge. The prince admitted that Dick was fast, but he believed that this was not enough to win, and Dick replied that everything depended on whether they could hit him. The prince asked what speed could do against absolute strength. Then Dick became interested in seeing his absolute strength. The prince had the strength of 81 bulls, so he was not sure that Dick could withstand even one blow. Afterwards, he attacked Dick, and he said that this time, Dick would not dodge. And at that moment, Dick really did get hit. Because of this, Mia began to worry about him. And Rihanna thought that Dick must be seriously injured. The prince thought that Dick's speed had not helped him. But at that moment, he found himself behind him, and he tried to attack the prince. But he noticed Dick and decided to block his attack with his own blow. Then their hands touched, and this created a powerful explosion in the middle of the arena. After that, Dick jumped back, and he asked if these were all the abilities of the Prince of the Black Region. But the prince replied that he had only just begun. At that moment, an ominous force enveloped him. Dick thought this would be a great sparring partner for him. Meanwhile, the other princes enjoyed the spectacle, and Mia thought that Dick might have a chance of winning. At that moment, the third prince rushed towards Dick. He tried to strike, but Dick dodged. Then he struck with his other hand. Dick was surprised that he was thrown into the air by inertia. While attacking, the guy said that his blow was comparable to the strength of 100 bulls. After he attacked, the wind rose around him. Mia began to worry about Dick, And Rihanna asked sarcastically if it hurt Mia that her little brother was being beaten. Meanwhile, the prince's attack caused smoke to rise, making it impossible to see anything. At that moment Dick was behind him, and suddenly he attacked the prince in the back. Turning around, the prince wondered if the wild smoke was using it to attack him, but then Dick was already attacking from the front. The prince replied that Dick was naive if he thought he could win with such tricks. Suddenly a wind rose around the prince, and having cleared away the smoke, the prince asked where Dick would now hide. Having said this, he rushed towards the guy. When they collided, they immediately pulled away from each other. Rihanna and Carl came to the conclusion that Dick could not cope with the third prince. But the next moment the girl was surprised, because Dick continued to advance. Carl replied that they should still be grateful to the third prince, otherwise they would not have known Dick's true strength. Mia was worried that if this continued, Dick would be at a disadvantage. Then she decided to give Dick her sword. Dick accepted it. Although he had previously wanted to practice palm techniques, he decided to end this fight quickly and attacked. The third prince was surprised to see the approaching threat. However, he dodged it, and only the ground was damaged. When he was back on the ground, Dick was already rushing towards him. He told Dick that no matter how strong he was still a warrior of the third region. After that, they collided again, and an explosion occurred. When the smoke cleared, it became clear that the third prince had fallen. Carl and Rihanna couldn't believe the prince's defeat, and Mia understood that Dick could have won right away, but he was delaying his victory. Everyone was surprised to hear that Dick had actually been holding back. However, the prince refused to admit his defeat and wanted to fight again. He asked the wild man to stop because the fight was not over yet, but Dick asked whether it really mattered who won and who lost. Afterwards, he thanked Mia for the sword. Hugging Dick, she asked why he didn't say that he could have defeated the prince right away. Rihanna was irritated by the fact that the two of them were showing off their close relationship in front of everyone. Suddenly, she decided to challenge Mia to a fight. Mia immediately agreed, because she wanted to take revenge on Rihanna for the last time. She had been waiting for this opportunity for a long time, so she was ready to fight right away. Rihanna prepared for battle. Mia also held her sword in front of her and used one of her techniques. Suddenly, water formed around her and rushed towards Rihanna. Rihanna noticed that Mia had grown during this time, but she believed that she could still defeat the girl. With ease, she was able to cut the flow of water in half. And when she did, she immediately made eye contact with Mia. This caught Mia off guard. Without wasting any time, Rihanna decided to attack her opponent. But Mia came to her senses and defended herself with her sword. In anger, Rihanna shouted that Mia should surrender. Then she swung her sword, knocking the sword out of Mia's hands and pushing her back. Rihanna said that just like last time, she won. And since Mia couldn't even hold a sword in her hands, Rihanna decided that the difference between them was very big. Mia guessed that Rihanna was deliberately trying to embarrass her. But Rihanna replied that she didn't mean to humiliate her and didn't know that Mia was so bad with a sword. Her words offended Mia. Suddenly Dick intervened and said that Rihanna's cultivation was a whole stage higher, and he asked if Rihanna really thought that such a victory proved superiority. Rihanna replied that everyone saw how she defeated Mia with one move. Dick suggested that they fight again in a month, and if Rihanna won, he would apologize to her. Mia was touched that Dick was willing to apologize to Rihanna for her. Rihanna immediately agreed, already looking forward to the day when Dick would be on his knees before her. When Dick said that if she lost, Rihanna would be the one to apologize, the girl still agreed. But in reality, Rihanna still had no intention of apologizing to him. Carl later said that if Dick offered such a deal, it meant he was confident of victory. But Rihanna thought that Carl was worried because she would soon become even stronger. Moreover, Carl promised to give her a black blood pill so that she could move to the Black Realm. Carl continued that with her talent she would easily achieve this. But Dick also had his merits. Rihanna replied that if Dick had crossed the Queen, he would not live long. Meanwhile, Mia told Dick that his idea was stupid. Dick decided to remind that in 6 months, he had reached the yellow area. Suddenly remembering this, Mia asked him how he managed it, but she immediately came to her senses and apologized, because it must have been a secret. Dick told her not to worry about it, and asked if she was practicing the ice formula, a low-grade exercise. Mia replied that their family was lucky to have at least 3 exercises, so she was lucky. Suddenly Dick said that if she kept his secret, he would give her a ghost-level exercise. Surprised, she asked where he got such an exercise. Dick immediately said that the exercise he would give was divided into 7 levels. That same evening, Mia promised not to tell anyone about it. Dick continued that with this exercise, she would be able to reach the yellow area. Mia didn't know how she could thank Dick for this. Dick replied that he didn't need anything, and that it would be better for her to start practicing right away. Mia suddenly said that if he were not her brother, she would not mind marrying him. But she quickly walked away from the guy, and said that she would not tease him anymore. Mia decided to get straight to practice so that Dick's efforts wouldn't go to waste. She wanted to make Rihanna regret what she did against Dick. 20 days later, Dick also continued his practice. The Emperor, watching him, wondered whether Dick would be able to reach the highest realm of cultivation. Now Dick was close to the area where his blow would be equal to 100 bulls. The cat said the difference might be minor, but moving on to the next area was very important. Dick suggested that to do this, he needed to raise the level of the dragon and elephant techniques. The cat agreed, because while the technology was at a low level, it did not reveal its full potential. Dick continued that he needed combat experience, but there was not a single worthy fighter in the palace. Then he decided that he could practice by killing wild animals. But the cat thought Dick was crazy, because it was risky. Dick soon put his plan into action. He immediately noticed that his speed was no match for the monster in front of him. Suddenly the lion dragon roared at him, and then he rushed towards him, trying to attack. But Dick reacted and managed to dodge. At that moment, it was a good moment to attack, and he attacked the lion. But one attack was not enough, and he attacked again and again. Because of their battle, an explosion was heard in the forest. The commander was offered to help the prince, but he reminded him that the king had ordered not to interfere. Soon after, the lion was defeated, but Dick chuckled that even high-level beasts pretended to be dead in order to survive. When the lion was bitten, he tried to attack again. The unexpected attack caught Dick off guard. Only at the very last moment was he able to dodge. And then he decided to attack the beast. Using his palm technique, he created a powerful attack. After this, Dick decided that with his current strength, he could stand up for himself. The commander was surprised that the prince was already able to overcome such a beast. Afterwards, he ordered the lion's corpse to be sold, and the money to be given to the prince. Soon after, Dick returned to cultivation. He could stay underwater for a long time, but at some point he was able to break through to the next stage. Now his dragon and elephant technique was at the 3rd level. With its help, he created a huge wave. The light emanating from Dick's body continued to cause commotion. Dick's companions watched this from the side. The commander thought that Dick was being blessed, and that he should kneel. They instantly fell to their knees, and Dick was surprised to see this blessing before his eyes. The old man asked the king if he knew what this ray of light was. The king had not seen anything like this either, but he guessed that it was a blessing. Now Dick was convinced that upon reaching a certain area, a blessing was given, and he finally took a step towards becoming a powerful warrior. He was the son of a king before, but he had never seen such pure energy. He immediately wanted to use the new power, and then he struck down on the water with all his might. The commander immediately decided to report what had happened to the king. Soon the king asked the man if he was sure of what he was saying. Convinced that he was telling the truth, the king wanted to meet the prince, and he ordered the commander to keep what happened a secret. Soon the king arrived to the 9th prince. Noticing that someone had arrived, Dick immediately turned around. But the king asked the guy to relax and said that he just decided to see him. And then he asked Dick to attack him with his strongest blow. Dick did not argue with the king. He immediately jumped up and swung at his father. The king was surprised that Dick had gained such incredible power in such a short time. At that moment, Dick attacked him. However, he immediately noticed that he would not be able to break through the king's defense. The king said he was glad to see Dick's progress, but expected more from him. At that moment, Dick was thrown back by the king's protection, but he was able to find his balance almost immediately and was about to land. Then the king said that Dick's blow was the most powerful of those who reached the black area. Therefore, the king was convinced that Dick had been able to reach the absolute stage of the yellow area, and said that Dick would definitely surpass him. But the boy did not understand what the king was talking about. The man then said that he had chosen 2 paths for Dick. In the first one, he will join a sect. Dick asked what the second way was. The king replied that this path would be more difficult, and involved a market school of martial arts. Dick asked if the martial arts bank had set up a school. The king replied that this was so, and they were now recruiting students. Dick immediately chose the second path. Having received his answer, the king placed his hand on Dick's shoulder, and he said that the recruitment date would be announced within a month. Meanwhile, Locke continued his training. Watching him, Dick concluded that the guy had grown up over the years. Locke continued to practice constantly, and he became so experienced that he could easily cut tree leaves in half. Seeing this, Dick realized that Locke had perfected one of his techniques. Locke then said he wanted to try his hand at the black market. Dick agreed that perhaps Locke could find his way there. Suddenly the maid told Dick that Rihanna had come to see him. She said that a month had already passed, so Dick was invited to watch the fight. Dick decided to go and invited Locke to come with him. He decided that Rihanna was very confident and wondered how Mia's training had gone. Soon they arrived at the arena. Seeing Locke and Dick, Mia immediately greeted them. And Rihanna, seeing Locke, was surprised that he was still alive. Even though Locke was alive, the others thought he was no longer useful. Afterwards, someone was outraged that Locke served Rihanna but did not bend the knee to her. Locke got angry and said that as far as he remembered, The guy in front of him was the one who dealt the finishing blow to him. Locke's angry gaze made the boy feel uneasy. His friend asked him why he was afraid of the guy whose meridians were already destroyed, and he said that today he would help Rihanna teach Locke a lesson. With menacing words, he swung at the guy. However, Locke was faster and attacked the enemy first. Mia asked Dick why Locke had such an aura, and the guy replied that Locke had chosen the path of the Reaper. Wounded, his opponent fell to the ground. Rihanna was surprised that she couldn't even see Locke's movements, but Carl immediately noticed that Locke had grown during this time. Carl told him that he used to belong to Rihanna, but now that had changed. But Rihanna replied that once you become a servant, you always remain one. The guy replied that he served her because she saved his life, but she herself decided to get rid of him, and if she insisted that he become a servant again, he promised that Rihanna's life would not last long. Rihanna was outraged by this and called her security. Suddenly Dick intervened and said that he would buy Locke. She thought Dick was ready to beg on his knees, but the guy replied that it didn't matter. Then Rihanna agreed to sell it for $1,000,000 silver. Then Mia intervened and said that this was a real robbery. She said that even a servant who reached the Black Realm was worth less than 10,000 coins. But Rihanna replied that a good man cost money. Dick agreed that he would send the money within a month. And then he turned to Locke and said that, compared to his talent, this amount was pennies. Give the servant's contract. Rihanna told Dick that his money would become loyal when she got married. Mia was infuriated by Rihanna's arrogant face. Having received the paper, Dick immediately tore it up. Amazed by this, Locke was grateful and promised to repay Dick. The audience was also surprised by Dick's action, and some admired the fact that Dick was so generous. Then Mia intervened and told Rihanna to get rid of her pride. Rihanna replied that Mia had a good attitude, but she wondered if Mia's arrogance would remain if she lost a second time. But Mia promised to give it her all to win. If she won, Rihanna wanted Dick to do her a favor. And then I asked Dick's opinion on this matter. Dick replied that he was confident that Mia would win. After listening to him, Rihanna warned him not to deny it later, and Mia promised not to let Dick down. At that moment, Dick thought that she had reached the first level of cultivation. Then the princesses decided to stop talking and start fighting. Rihanna attacked more furiously. However, Mia confidently blocked her attack. Meanwhile, Mia's sister loudly supported her. Rihanna believed that she would always be one step ahead of Mia, but Mia replied that they were on the same level, because Rihanna was also at the peak of the yellow area. After this, she decided to create distance from Rihanna, and then she prepared to attack. But Rihanna was sure that Mia was no match for her, and prepared to strike first. She struck with the sacred sword. But Mia decided to attack her with water, just like last time. Then their two attacks collided. However, Rihanna's attack caught Mia and she injured her arm. Then she tried to move away. Rihanna said that Mia disappointed her, but Mia replied that even if she lost, she would not allow her brother to be discredited. Then Dick shouted and advised Mia to keep her distance from Rihanna. Rihanna attacked but Mia dodged. Rihanna shouted that even with Dick's help she couldn't win. However, Mia agreed that she couldn't let Rihanna near her. Rihanna kept trying to close the distance to strike, but since Mia kept leaving her, she thought that Mia was doing this because she couldn't do anything against Rihanna. At that moment she attacked again, but Mia held her sword out. Even though she blocked the attack, she was pushed back. At that moment, Mia thought that Rihanna should already be exhausted, which means she would have the advantage. Rihanna was sure that if Dick hadn't intervened, Mia would have already lost to her. Dick continued to advise Mia to stay away and wait for the right moment. Carl asked if he would help Rihanna since Dick was helping Mia. After receiving Dick's consent, Carl advised Mia to use a technique that would cut off Mia's escape route. Rihanna immediately decided to try this technique. Because of this, Rihanna's attack range has become wider. Seeing this, Mia tensed up, but she didn't have time to react and was injured. Then Dick advised her on a certain technique for attack. Hearing him, she gripped her sword tighter, and then she swung with all her might. Suddenly, her attack appeared in front of Rihanna. Due to the surprise, she did not have time to dodge and was injured. The blow threw her back and she dropped her sword. Then Dick shouted at Mia to finish the job. At that moment, the girl suddenly approached Rihanna, and again she made 2 attacks. At that moment, Rihanna was lying on the ground and could not dodge, so the whole blow fell on her. Seeing this, her servants began to worry, but Carl knew that this was not enough to kill Rihanna. Dick understood this too, and advised Mia not to let her guard down. Soon everyone saw that Rihanna was also lying on the ground. Mia said that they were both injured, and asked if Rihanna wanted to continue fighting. But Rihanna said that Mia was almost a defeated opponent. At that moment, Carl told her a new technique. Rihanna suddenly grabbed the sword and attacked Mia. Dick told Mia to back up a little and strike as well. Following his advice, Mia did exactly the same. After being wounded, Rihanna felt pain, but their fight continued to be exciting. Dick thought that if the fight continued, they would both get hurt, and that was not what he wanted. Suddenly he took Locke's weapon. and he asked Mia to look at how he held the sword. Hearing the name of the technique Dick wanted to show her, Mia felt annoyed because she hadn't learned it yet. With Dick's help, Mia was able to apply that technique, and Rihanna was backed into a corner. At the very last moment she tried to dodge, but in this gesture, Mia saw an opportunity for herself. In an instant she was behind Rihanna, and she put a sword to her neck. At that moment the fight could be considered over. Mia said she won. Everyone had different emotions from what they saw, but the undisputed winner was Mia. When Dick admitted he was worried, Locke said he didn't know Dick could do that. Slowly, Rihanna stood up straight. But Mia told her not to move, because it would be bad if she accidentally hurt her face. Rihanna said that if it weren't for Dick, Mia would never have beaten her. Rihanna wanted to fight again, and if Mia lost, she would become her servant for 10 years. But Rihanna had already lost, so Mia wanted to hear her apologize and kneel down. Rihanna promised to apologize, but they didn't agree that she would kneel. At that moment, Mia intentionally injured Rihanna's neck. Then Carl intervened and asked for Rihanna to be spared. Mia said that the 7th prince's servant has no right to speak to the princess, and then she ordered him to kneel. Carl didn't expect to hear that, but since he continued to just stand there, Mia became irritated. So she repeated the order. Carl was stunned that Mia had embarrassed him, but still, she was a princess. So he bowed to her. Afterwards, Mia told Rihanna that if she paid 1 million silver, she would not have to kneel. But Rihanna was indignant and asked where she could get such a sum. Mia replied that she could demand them from the 9th brother. Rihanna knew that if she knelt down, she would hurt Dick too. She curled her lips in displeasure, and then she fell to her knees, and she asked Mia for forgiveness. Mia didn't expect this from her and thought that Dick would have to spend all the money. The princes did not expect the proud Rihanna to kneel. Rihanna's servants also couldn't believe that she did it. Standing up, Rihanna told Dick not to forget to send them the money. Later, she burst into tears and said that she didn't want to see Mia and Dick. She was going to train and one day kill Mia personally, and Carl promised to recommend Mia to the palace when she reached the absolute realm. Mia thanked him and asked if she could meet the 7th prince there. Carl confirmed this and added that under the prince's protection, she would not be lost. Dick warned Mia that in the future, Rihanna would try to take revenge on her. But Mia said she just wanted to help Dick get the money back, not humiliate Rihanna. Afterwards, Dick gave her an immortality pill that would increase the chance of a breakthrough. The red pill was in the box. Seeing her, Mia's eyes sparkled with delight. And then she asked Dick to accept her gratitude. And she told Dick that she would miss him. In a month, Dick was supposed to leave for the market martial arts school. But he was worried about his sister, whom he treasured. He was sure that Rihanna would start taking revenge on Mia. But Locke asked him not to worry, because while he was in the city, he would keep an eye on Mia. Suddenly Dick said that since they helped each other, they should have been friends on equal terms. But Carl was surprised that the prince was willing to be friends with someone like him. A month passed and Leah asked Dick to be careful on the road. It was the first time they were separated, so she was very worried about her son. She had already heard that he had fallen out with Rihanna, but he hoped that they would make up. Dick only promised her that as long as he wasn't provoked, he wouldn't touch anyone. And he promised that if they insulted Leah, he would wipe out the lands. However, at that moment he was hit on the head. Mia asked what nonsense he was talking about, and then she said that she would take care of Leah, so he could rest easy. When saying goodbye, Dick replied that he would also wait for him at the market school. As she watched him go, Mia thought that she too would train and reach the absolute realm. The queen was angry that they were always looking for an opportunity to kill Dick, but now they were letting him get away. But Carl replied that since the guy had left the city, it would be easier to kill him. The queen asked if they were going to send someone after him to kill him. Carl said that without the protection of his family, he would be eliminated and die in a foreign land. Dick soon arrived at the scene. The girls were delighted to see him, because he was now one of the most talented. But there were also those who were indifferent to him. Dick was immediately told that Chuck had been waiting for him for a long time, but Dick was a little surprised by this reception. Chuck greeted Dick and said that after losing to him, he had been thinking about many things and had suddenly reached the absolute realm. But Dick thought the boy didn't look anything like the spoiled version of himself. Chuck said that without Dick's support, he wouldn't have reached this area so quickly. Soon everyone was assembled. The owner said that he hoped Dick and his son would have a good relationship, since he and Dick's father had previously been friends. Dick replied that if his son reformed, Dick would be willing to open up. The man immediately noticed that Dick continued to maintain his composure, and then he told Chuck that he could learn a lot from Dick. Dick thought that he could become friends with many people if these people would put aside their hostility. Suddenly a huge bird appeared in the sky. People were surprised to see the bloodhawk, which was the third most powerful animal. Then the owner greeted the newcomer. It was the elder of their market who asked if dozens of people would take their exams. The man replied that there were more people taking the exam this year, so there might be surprises. but the elder asked if the young men could make it into the top 10. The owner replied that it would be more interesting if the man himself observed everything. Soon everyone set off on a hawk in an unknown direction. Suddenly a girl stood up from her seat. Chuck was surprised to see her. Noticing this, Dick followed his gaze. The girl asked if she could sit next to Dick and received consent. Meanwhile, Chuck was delighted with her figure. Looking at the girl, Dick thought that she seemed hostile to him. Chuck asked how Dick could be so calm in front of this girl, and said that her name was Irie. Dick calmly replied that if Chuck wanted to start his life over, he had to stop being a womanizer. Meanwhile, Irie thought that if Dick died by her hand, he could consider it lucky. Suddenly she pulled out the needle. Dick immediately noticed this, and he followed her movements, while Irie was surprised how he could notice it. Dick saw that she had put the needle behind her ear, and then I thought it was disappointing that he was using the same weapon. Meanwhile, Irie's partner thought that she was useless, and that he would have to do everything himself. Then he threw a needle at Dick, but she couldn't touch the guy, crashing into the barrier. In the space closest to Dick, nothing could be hidden from his sight, so he noticed and grabbed the needle. And then he asked the guy if he was a professional killer. The boy didn't answer, and was surprised that Dick was able to notice his attack. Once he was discovered, all he had to do was attack head-on, but Dick was surprised that they hoped to kill him, relying on stupid tricks. At that moment, their escort became outraged by what had happened, and attacked the killer. Having been wounded, he flew away from Dick. Dick and Chuck were surprised that the guy was killed so easily, and Irie was horrified at what would have happened to her if she had attacked first. The lifeless body of the killer fell. After quickly checking his body, Chuck confirmed that the guy was dead. Many were surprised by what happened. The man said that this killer was clearly from the afterlife, and then he asked Dick what he had done that made the killers target him. Chuck answered for him, saying that Dick was the 9th prince and a martial arts genius. The man agreed that only a genius could reach the absolute realm, but he was no match for the 7th prince. He then ordered Chuck to throw the body off the hawk. The guy quickly followed the order and threw down the corpse. Soon Dick approached Irie. At that moment she hoped that Dick hadn't figured her out, and she didn't understand why such pressure was coming from a person who had just reached the absolute realm. But she immediately decided that she couldn't just sit, and she gripped the weapon she was hiding in her hand tighter. But at that moment Chuck came up to them and asked Dick to rest. Because of this, Dick silently left Irie. Irie was able to breathe a sigh of relief, because if she had pulled out the knife, she would have definitely died. Chuck continued to say that once they entered the academy grounds, the assassins would be unable to do anything to Dick. But Dick knew he had to be careful, because if the queen hired assassins, even the academy would be unsafe. Soon after they arrived at the academy, the man asked who was guarding the magic field and asked to open the gate. After this, they were able to enter the academy grounds. Upon seeing Dick, everyone began to whisper about his identity. Immediately he saw a stone on which the name of the academy was written. Dick thought that the man who wrote this must have attained heavenly power. Suddenly someone said that few people came from the kingdom. The man said that their kingdom seemed to be getting worse year after year. But, offended, someone decided to challenge him. The man agreed to take back his words if 3 of his attacks could stop him. But his opponent was outraged that he was underestimated. Enraged, he began to attack. The girls were surprised that this guy was incredibly strong. But Dick noticed that the guy who initially started the fight was not so simple. Reacting, he hit the attacker. And everyone was surprised, not expecting this from him. And Dick only became convinced that this man was strong and fast. The man was disappointed that today's fighters couldn't even detect the enemy's movements, and he said that such scum was unworthy of studying at this academy. Then he decided to finish off his opponent. Alarmed, Chuck tried to warn the lion guy about the danger, but at that moment Dick stood up for him. He was able to easily parry the attacker's blow. The man was then surprised that someone was able to stop his attack. Afterwards, Dick handed the wounded boy an immortality pill. He asked not to thank him because he still had a pill. At that moment, the man admitted that it was cool, and he didn't expect that anyone would be able to answer him. He decided that the prince was very strong and asked to show them something. The elder wanted to intervene, but he was stopped, because the boys were simply competing in skills. The elder, after thinking, decided not to interfere, because knowing that the man in front of him was a prince, the man would not attack with all his might. Dick refused, since it was not exam time, and asked to pay for the injured man's medical expenses. And he said that if the man paid 30,000 silver coins, he would be released. But the man laughed and said that the prince did not have courage. He added that it was a disgrace for his kingdom. While attacking, he said that even if Dick fought against him, he would lose. Suddenly Chuck decided to challenge him, but the man didn't want to fight someone small like Chuck, and if he lost to the prince, he would pay money and apologize. These words angered the blonde. Then other observers joined in and agreed that the prince was simply chickening out. Hearing the man's proposal, Dick agreed. but named the sum of 100,000 silver. Such a huge sum outraged the man, but Dick reminded that he had recently been shouting very loudly, but in fact he had no money. As he rushed into the attack, the man said that Dick still couldn't win. When he attacked, Dick stood still. But suddenly he activated a clear gaze, and with its help he easily dodged the attack. And immediately after that he struck his opponent. It was so strong that the man flew back. Then Chuck laughed and said that he would never defeat the 9th prince. The rest of the spectators thought they couldn't even see Dick's movements. And Dick's opponent asked him how the guy moved so fast. At that moment, Dick stood calmly behind him. Noticing him, the man turned around, but Dick's foot was already approaching him. And then he received a blow to the chest with all his might. Some were surprised that Dick hid his abilities from the very beginning. Already completely beaten, the man asked Dick to stop. Dick said that since he lost, he had to pay 100,000. But the man replied that he only had 30,000. Chuck decided to intervene to stop Dick from doing things like collecting debts. But Dick asked him to go easy on the loser. Chuck angrily asked why the 4th prince of his family couldn't afford 100,000. And he stepped on his hand, angry that the man himself had agreed to such conditions. At that moment the man screamed in pain, and Dick reminded that he asked to be more gentle. Turning to the elder, Chuck asked if the man had heard it too. The elder confirmed that debts must be paid. Chuck spoke to the man again and said that if he didn't bring in 100,000 today, Chuck would beat the crap out of him. Then he pressed his hand again, asking what he thought about it. The man immediately cried out for mercy and promised to bring money. Then he reached into his pocket, and taking out a small bag, he said that this was all he had. Chuck was angry that he only had 30,000. Then he asked Dick what they should do, but interrupted the guy and decided for himself. And he decided to finally beat up the loser. Dick decided to simply watch from the sidelines. He thought that it was a good thing that Chuck hadn't caught him earlier. Otherwise he would have beaten him up too. Chuck also took expensive items from the man, which in total cost another 20,000. Then he wanted the man to sign an IOU. Dick was finally convinced that Chuck was a real bully. Chuck even forced me to sign a receipt. At that moment someone intervened and told them to stop. Some guy said that even if a guy doesn't have enough money, they shouldn't humiliate him. A prince from the same kingdom stood up for him. Chuck immediately warned Dick that the prince was dangerous. Dick asked why they should tolerate being humiliated, but the prince replied that it was natural for the strong to humiliate the weak. Dick replied that in that case, there was nothing wrong with them disgracing that warrior. But the prince said that Dick should not be so sure. Afterwards, the prince left, promising that they would meet at tomorrow's exam. Approaching Chuck, Dick asked if it was permissible to kill people during the exam. Chuck said it wasn't allowed, but the first stage was on a mountain where they might try to kill them. Then everyone was afraid that everything could end badly for them. Eri asked why they couldn't respond in kind. Turning to Dick, she said that if they cooperated, they would cause serious damage. Dick replied that since she was determined, they would fight to the end. The girl was glad when Dick trusted her. The next day they started ringing the bell. The examinees were greeted at the beginning of the exam. There was a hierarchy within the academy that could be seen in their clothing, so Dick wondered what they would be wearing after passing the exam. The first stage of the exam was hunting wild animals, and the second was passing an obstacle course. Also, people at different stages of cultivation had different goals to achieve, and each high-quality or average animal was equated to several low-level ones. Dick speculated that if the test subjects encountered a high-level beast, they would not survive. This caused panic among the participants. Chuck reassured everyone that in theory, no one should encounter a high-level one. Also, before the start, each participant was given a unicorn ball that would save them in case of danger. After all the explanations, the start of the exam was announced. Dick, too, was glad that it had finally all started. The prince ordered his men to kill immediately if they met anyone from the kingdom of Dick. And if someone killed Dick, he promised to reward him with the treasures of the Lord of the North. Soon Dick and Eri were walking through the forest. Eri wanted to kill the other examinees to take their beast eyes for herself. Suddenly she crouched down to the ground. And then she said that the prince was here 15 minutes ago. It turns out that she snuck into their room in the evening and remembered the scent of each person. Dick thought she was either a saint or had been practicing her charm since childhood. Eri confirmed that one of her ancestors was a saint, but she is the only one left from their family. But immediately after, she suggested tracking down the prince. Meanwhile, the rest had already begun hunting animals. Suddenly the guy heard some sound. Turning around, he saw Dick. Dick asked why the man was glad to see him. Then he said that the prince had promised a reward for Dick's head. Having said this, he prepared his sword and attacked Dick. But Dick calmly said that the man would not stop him. When the man's attack dissipated, Dick asked if he still wanted to kill him. The man didn't understand how Dick could neutralize his attack. But at that moment, Eri appeared behind him. With lightning speed, she cut off his head. Dick looked at the corpse for a moment, And then he asked why it was necessary to kill the man if it was possible to simply neutralize him. The girl replied that he had already reached the final stage, and if he had not died, he would have definitely taken revenge. Then she asked for the spoils to be distributed. The girl decided to take the money for herself and give the weapon to Dick. Dick did not object and immediately agreed. Suddenly, Aries' gaze became surprised. It was because she saw a spatial artifact on Dick. Dick replied that such a ring suited girls better and offered it to Aries. She chuckled at the fact that he was willing to give away such a valuable thing so easily, and said that a man does not give a woman a ring for no reason. But Dick asked what she was even talking about if he was only 16. Then Aries wanted to take a closer look at the ring. Dick gave the ring and told him to pour his energy into it. When she put the ring on, she immediately decided that it was incredible, but she couldn't take it just like that and offered soul crystals for it. When she asked why he was giving away such a thing, Dick said that he did not believe that he would meet a man who would repay good with evil. After this phrase, Aries pulled out her weapon, and she put the sword to Dick's neck. Dick calmly asked what she was doing. Aries said it was obvious. She was going to kill and rob Dick. Dick said that killing for money was a good reason. Aries was struck by how calm Dick was at that moment. Dick replied that once you die, it's not scary to die a second time. At that moment, Aries felt uneasy under the pressure coming from Dick. Putting away her sword, she said she just wanted to show that people are treacherous. Afterwards, she agreed to accept the ring and offered to continue tracking down the warriors. But Dick was already convinced that Aries was from the underworld. Soon they tracked down one girl. After Aries' attack, she couldn't move. They had already killed 8 people, so Aries suggested stopping for today. Dick asked why kill them if their cultivation could be annulled. Aries replied that Dick's people were not slaughtered because they were good people. At that moment, the archer shot at Aries. The arrow, shrouded in magic, began to approach the girl. Dick noticed this and tried to warn Aries. Turning around, Aries saw an arrow. Dick managed to run to Aries and push her away. The arrow pierced the log on which Aries was sitting with destructive force. Aries said there was only one excellent marksman. The archer said that Aries was worthy of being a top-class master. Taking aim, he was ready to shoot again. But Dick replied that the boy would not be able to hit them with his arrows. But the shooter said that a few years ago his father almost shot Dick's father, and he promised that even Dick would begin to serve them. Dick realized that they wanted to provoke him and then stab him in the back. In response, the archer merely asked if Dick could kill him, and Dick was willing to try. Meanwhile, Aries was happy to see Dick's fencing. The archer was surprised when Dick moved towards him, and suddenly he saw that Dick had simply disappeared. He moved so quickly that the archer could not keep track of him. But then he turned around, finally finding the guy, and he shot 3 arrows at once. However, they only pierced Dick's shadow. Seeing Dick's speed, Aries realized that the decision to kill the prince was very reckless. At that moment, Dick found himself behind the archer. Surprised by the speed of the wild one, the guy turned around. But at that moment, Dick had already launched an attack. But the guy managed to react and step back. When Dick asked what he would do now, the boy replied that Dick was within his reach. And then I used a different technique. Noticing this, Aries tried to warn Dick. Dick didn't have time to dodge, and at that moment it pierced him right through. The needle passed through him without leaving any blood. Aries was worried about Dick, but in reality, if Dick died, she wouldn't be able to cope on her own. Then the archer was glad that because of this, he could be promoted. However, Dick chuckled, and then he straightened up. Suddenly, he found himself right in front of the archer, and he struck him with his sword. The guy didn't understand how Dick was able to dodge his attack. Dick asked the archer if he had heard of the spatial domain. At the moment of attack, Dick released a spatial area. The shot collided with her and changed its territory. But the guy asked who would even believe such a thing. After all, since ancient times there has been no one who had the seal of time and space. Dick decided to tell that he had such a seal, because the archer would soon die anyway. The archer thought that if he spread such a secret, then Dick would be in the crosshairs of condemnation. Suddenly Dick saw that the guy took the pill, and then an explosion occurred in its place. Aries wanted to catch up with him, but Dick refused, considering it too much trouble. Instead, he used the all-seeing eye, and he was able to track down the archer instantly. Aries was surprised when he said he found a boyfriend. Running forward, he told her to take her sword. Having caught up with the archer, Dick immediately attacked him. An explosion and screams were heard in the middle of the forest. Soon Dick killed the archer. Aries reminded him that he didn't want to kill, but the boy replied that the archer himself was looking for death. Aries replied that this guy's family would be furious, but Dick only suggested that she continue hunting. Aries didn't expect Dick to be so determined when it came to killing. The next day they found the dead girl. Dick decided that she had been abused before her death, and Aries immediately guessed who killed her. She said that guy had reached the lowest level of the extreme absolute realm. He was also said to have cultivated dark arts. While Aries was horrified, Dick suggested burying the girl. They soon finished with this. In anger, Dick said he would kill that guy, but suddenly they noticed that someone was next to them. Then someone's shadow covered them. The prince did not expect to be noticed so quickly. Turning in the air, he rushed down. He said that Dick and Eri were amazing, because 15 of his warriors died because of them yesterday. Dick asked how he tracked them down. Someone replied that they simply found the people they had killed. The guy said that following a bloody trail is easy. Dick and Eri immediately turned to look at the blonde. And he immediately noticed Eri. He decided that by absorbing Eri's true key, he would immediately reach the middle extreme absolute realm. Automatically, Eri immediately tensed up, and she said that since they had set up an ambush, they should all come out. Suddenly everything around them began to move, and soon they were surrounded. The prince was surprised that they thought they had a chance of winning, but it is not easy to cope with such a number of people. The prince replied that even if they crushed the unicorn's ball, no one would come to save them. Dick chuckled that everything was planned so well that it seemed like they would actually die. But Dick was told that only he would die, and there were other plans for the girl. This immediately angered Eri, so she immediately decided to attack one of the men. Before he could come to his senses, her sword was right there. But at that moment the blonde was able to intercept the sword. He squeezed it so tightly that Eri couldn't move it. She was frightened by the realization that the guy was using monstrification. That's why I decided to step back. The guy confirmed that he was able to improve the paw of a low-level beast. And then he attacked Eri. Due to the surprise, she was unable to dodge. Dick thought that if he didn't help her, everything would end badly. Eri was terrified that she couldn't dodge the attacks. The guy said that if she didn't resist, it would be easier for her. But suddenly a sword appeared in front of him, which he dodged. It turns out that Dick threw this sword at him. Everyone was surprised that Dick dropped his weapon so easily. Then they decided to pounce on Dick. Suddenly he found himself behind one of them, and he told them that he could use more than just a sword. Dick's attack was so powerful that it blinded everyone around him. Because of her, he eliminated several people at once. Meanwhile, the blonde tried to grab Eri, but was delaying it. Then the prince agreed to give him 30 warrior girls, if only he would kill Eri. With difficulty, the blonde accepted this offer. At that moment he almost reached Eri. However, she was able to kick him. It didn't do any harm to the guy, and he said that Eri wouldn't run away. She also turned out to be stronger than he thought. Eri was offended that she attacked with all her strength, and he didn't even dodge. Then she kicked him in the jaw, but her attack only amused the guy. At the same time, Eri noticed her weapon. She immediately grabbed the sword. Watching her, the guy said that it was interesting. Meanwhile, she had already used sword ki, and soon she pounced on the guy. But he easily stopped her sword again. But even so, it did not stop the powerful explosion. Eri was amazed that he stopped her snowstorm without any difficulty. Then the guy said that surrendering was the right decision for Eri, but Eri ignored him and moved away. Then the blonde decided to attack her again. Because of this, Eri began to receive many wounds. She understood that if this continued, she would be doomed. She suddenly thought she wanted to kill Dick, but he really understood what friendship was. Gathering her strength, she decided to attack again. Watching her, the guy suddenly came to the conclusion that it was dangerous. He didn't have time to dodge her attack. Dick immediately heard the roar of this attack, so he decided that Eri had given it her all. But she was left with almost no strength and lost consciousness. The guy was glad that he would finally have fun with her, but suddenly they tried to attack him. At that moment, Dick managed to come to the rescue. He swung with all his might, but the blonde didn't have time to dodge out of surprise. Having taken the blow, the blonde staggered back. Afterwards, he laughed at the fact that the prince was able to wound him, and the wound I had just received immediately began to heal. Dick was surprised by this ability to regenerate. At that moment, the blonde decided to attack Dick, but he was calm and in no hurry to dodge. Instead, he created a protective barrier. Not paying attention to this, the blonde tried to break through the defense. He was delighted with what was happening and dreamed of getting to the dike. At that moment, there was a loud explosion, but when he got to Eri, she told the guy that he was a dead body, and Dick was behind him. Before he could come to his senses, Dick was already attacking him. The blonde didn't expect Dick to use the girl as bait, and then he managed to repel Dick's attack. And he tried to grab the guy's sword, and then he began to attack furiously. His attacks were fast and accurate. Dick was amazed by the strength of his opponent. He held back every blow, but if this continued, he could get hurt. At some point, Dick approached the rock. The blonde suggested avoiding the attack this time too, but Dick used the all-seeing eye, and thanks to this, I was able to guess the right moment to dodge. Turning around, the blonde assumed that the guy was anticipating his movements. Eri asked Dick if he was okay. Dick jumped back, creating distance between them. And then he asked Eri if she could fight. She replied that she was fine and they could work together. With Eri injured, Dick decided to distract the blonde while she killed the other 5. But she refused, because the blonde wouldn't kill her, but he would kill Dick. Rushing forward, the guy said that it was unlikely that this would happen. Because of Dick's courageous nature, Irie began to look up to him. At that moment, Dick was already engaged in combat. Irie watched them from the side. At that moment, the robbers offered her to fight them. But when she started to snap back, they immediately surrounded her. One girl suggested that Irie join them, because then Irie would have many advantages. But Irie was angered that the girl compared her to herself. The girl didn't even have time to notice how Irie had approached her. However, at that moment, one of the bandits approached Irie from behind. But the girl turned to him and asked if he had heard about diversionary maneuvers. After that, she turned around and hit him. The prince noticed that Irie attacked like a skilled assassin. At that moment, the prince wanted to leave them alive. However, the Irie continued to attack. She managed to put her sword under the blow. Irie angrily asked the girl if she was looking for death, and then she herself went on the attack. She delivered many fast attacks that were difficult to dodge. Because of this, her opponent suffered. Irie was determined to finish her off, and delivered the most powerful attack. There were still 3 opponents left, but she was out of strength. Irie had no choice but to risk everything or lose. So she began to gather all her remaining strength. Noticing this, Dick thought that Irie was going to risk her life. Initially, Irie wanted to kill Dick, but fighting him turned out to be an honor. Thinking about this, she rushed towards her opponent. Not expecting her attack, he did not have time to react and dodge. Immediately after him, Irie moved on to the next one. Having been wounded, the girl only had time to be surprised by Irie's speed. At that time, Irie moved towards the next enemy. Seeing Irie attacking, the boy became scared. Because of her speed, she killed them all almost simultaneously, and when she finished, she fell to her knees, and she gave the command to explode. As soon as she said this, a powerful explosion occurred, but she was close to him, so she was also affected. Noticing this, Dick began to worry about her. But when he was distracted, they decided to attack him. Turning around, Dick saw that they were already approaching him. However, he turned out to be faster and deftly ran away. The smoke from Irie's explosion gradually cleared. Unable to stand on her feet, the girl fell. After that fight, she was completely exhausted. Meanwhile, Dick decided to continue fighting rather than run away. He decided to keep his distance because he was not fast enough, and he decided to pull out another weapon. Now he had a weapon in both hands, but the blonde said that Dick could barely cope with even one. Having said this, he struck the rock. She collapsed, but Dick was already behind him. And then he struck. The blonde didn't have time to dodge. However, his back was immediately covered with dense scales. He turned around sharply and was about to hit Dick, but Dick remained calm and responded. With 2 weapons, it was easier for him to defend himself. Suddenly, the enemy approached him. Then he swung his sword. Because of this, a wound appeared on the guy's face. Dick was going to hit the enemy's defense until he broke it. He struck again with a powerful blow. The next moment, he twirled the sword in his hand, and he was going to destroy the enemy's defense. The enemy was unable to dodge the next blow. The prince was angry that his people had ended up disgraced. He asked if they wanted to force the prince to do everything personally. The guy apologized and promised to fix everything. Now he was angry that Dick had humiliated him, and he was going to destroy Dick. Dick replied that his mad look was proof that he was confused. But the guy asked me not to talk nonsense. He delivered a blow that Dick could not dodge. Soon the blonde began to smirk at Dick. However, after the impact, the guy quickly found his balance and landed on the ground. This surprised the blonde because he had definitely hit Dick. At that moment, Dick was already approaching him. Running up, he swung his arm furiously. And again, he struck the enemy. Trying to defend himself, the guy put his hand in front of himself. Dick knew he needed to finish the fight quickly. Suddenly, the blonde grinned. He said that Dick was the most pitiful enemy he had ever seen, and if Dick were a girl, he would take him. Suddenly, Dick imagined it, and he didn't want that to happen. So I decided to find out which of them would win. The blonde was surprised that Dick suddenly became so cheerful. Dick aimed at his opponent's head, but he managed to dodge at the last moment. Dick wondered how long the blonde would last. Then he attacked the guy in the torso. He even grabbed his chest from the pain. The prince thought that he would have to intervene after all. Finally, he took the bow and shot. The blonde didn't like the prince's interference. At that moment, the arrow was already flying towards Dick. When he turned around, his face was lit up by the flash of her approach. The prince was sure that he would kill Dick. Then the arrow pierced the guy's body. And then there was a powerful explosion. This force easily destroyed Dick's spatial domain. Dick was having a hard time dealing with the blonde, and then the prince intervened. The prince was angered that after the arrow, the wild animal remained alive. Then he grabbed the arrow again, and he shot Dick while he was helpless. But Dick remembered that the king had left him a trump card. At that moment, Dick took the form of a Keelan. Seeing this, the others thought it was too much. This may be why Dick survived the arrow. Dick thought the appearance looked like soft armor. The prince ordered that this appearance be taken away from Dick, and the blonde shouldn't have let him go. Then he rushed after Dick. However, the blonde wanted to finish off Dick. He swung and struck, but Dick blocked the blow. Despite this, Dick was still thrown back. But suddenly he grinned, because he noticed that Eri was approaching the blonde, and Dick himself was attacking him from the front. They hit him from both sides at the same time. The attack was fatal, so the blonde died immediately. Soon, Dick suggested that Eri change clothes, since he had a spare one with him. But Eri replied that she could not wear a man's clothes. The prince wondered if his subordinate had coped, but he realized that he couldn't leave everything to the blonde alone. Then he summoned a swarm of bees. Noticing them, Eri asked to take a look at it. Dick immediately recognized the poisonous bees. Suddenly, the emperor said he could help. Dick immediately asked him what the conditions would be. The cat replied that until Dick sealed him back into the scroll, he would give Dick many surprises. Dick immediately agreed, but Eri didn't understand who Dick was talking to. At that moment, Dick released the emperor, but Eri was surprised that Dick was talking to the cat. Afterwards, she asked Dick not to be distracted, because there were a lot of bees. But then the cat got wings, with the help of which he was going to rise into the sky. Dick was surprised that the cat could change his body like that. As he flew away, the cat said that Dick had to compensate him for the clothes. The prince was surprised to see a flying fat cat. But he was indignant and said that the emperor is not a fat cat. Then he hit the bird with his paw. Meanwhile, the number of bees only increased. Dick told Eri to attack while defending herself, and then he grabbed her and pulled her towards him. After that, they were under Dick's barrier. But the bees continued to circle around them. They had to wait until the bee whisperer was neutralized. Dick thought that since he and the cat had a blood contract, he would be able to hear it. Then he told the cat to act faster, but he wanted to enjoy his freedom. When Dick threatened to seal him away, the cat agreed to hurry. Dick asked him to hurry because he wouldn't be able to stand for long. Then the cat prepared a powerful attack. The prince immediately noticed this power. However, they did not have time to dodge and the blow caught them. Because of this, the flames engulfed them. Suddenly, the prince decided that it would be better for them to leave. Instantly, they turned around and began to fly away. The cat was surprised that the enemy ran away so quickly. Then Eri noticed that the bees were also flying away. Afterwards, she asked how the fat cat was able to drive the prince away. But Dick decided not to talk about it and gave her a pill to heal. Afterwards, they sat down to rest. Eri was itchy and hot. Then she started watching Dick, and she decided that since he was nearby, he would help her. But she herself was surprised by the fact that she had shameful desires. Suddenly, Dick noticed something approaching. The cat suddenly fell to the ground. Seeing this, he admitted that the cat had the strongest body. The cat agreed and admitted that he was also glad about it. But Dick replied that it was not praise. Dick asked if the prince had run away, and the cat replied that the only one who had not run away from him was Dick himself. Afterwards, he demanded the soul crystal, because he spent a lot of energy on the prince. While handing over the crystal, Dick asked him how he had increased his powers. The cat replied that when Dick became stronger, the seal in the tree that controlled the emperor's power opened, so the cat also became stronger. Afterwards, he decided to go back to restore his strength. Suddenly, Dick remembered Eri, and I decided to turn around and check her. Then the girl said that she had been poisoned. Hearing this, Dick became alarmed, and I immediately realized that she had been poisoned by bees. He knew that getting rid of bee venom would not be easy. Suddenly, Eri touched him, and she continued to say that she was hot and itchy all over. She made Dick feel uncomfortable, and he asked Eri to calm down. But the girl did not listen and insisted on her own. However, Dick's soul and body were quite unshakable due to cultivation. Suddenly, Eri pulled Dick's scarf off. At first, Dick didn't react, but Eri was getting closer and closer to him. Because of this, Dick had no choice. After knocking out Eri, he thought that they shouldn't have stayed in this place for long. At first, he decided to give her some sedative medicine. Dick imagined what would have happened to Eri if another guy had been nearby. Suddenly, he noticed that the prince had returned. At first, he decided to hide Eri. From above, they surveyed the area. The prince asked for help from his new servant, who promised not to let him down. He also asked the prince not to let anyone find them together. The prince agreed to act according to the proposed plan. After this, the servant went on a mission. Dick managed to watch them for a while. Now he decided to be even more careful, because later they might start causing problems again. Soon he decided to try one technique. There was a chance she could help cleanse Eri's body. Meanwhile, the girl was still unconscious. Suddenly, Dick pushed her hard in the back. This made her cough. Dick was afraid that he might accidentally harm her. But he soon realized that the technique had worked, and his QE was in Eri's body. Afterwards, he decided to continue acting. He continued to pour his energy into her body. Eri felt warm and didn't understand what was happening. She was unconscious, but she could feel what was happening. She finally woke up. Dick told her to get dressed first, and then he would explain everything. Seeing that she was naked, the girl became embarrassed. She immediately replied that Dick was shameless and had been rude to her. Dick said that after clearing her body of poison, she was weak, so it was better not to get angry or tense. He gave her clothes that were too big for her. Dick replied that she should be glad to have the opportunity to wear the prince's clothes. Then Eri asked if there was something between them. Dick replied that she had come at him herself, and then he showed what scratches she left on him. The girl became embarrassed and asked him to shut up. Afterwards, she couldn't stand on her feet and fell. Dick realized that there might still be poison left in Eri, but she replied that it was none of his business. Afterwards, Dick decided to give her the sword that we had in her possession. Seeing him, Eri realized that Dick already knew about her identity. Dick replied that the queen had hired assassins many times, and they all used similar weapons. Eri decided to say directly that she was also sent by the queen. Dick asked her not to start a fight, because even at her best, she was no match for him, and he asked if he would save her if he wanted to kill her. Eri was sure he had known for a long time that she was a killer. Dick replied that if she had wanted to kill him, he would already be dead, and since she had not killed him, then why shouldn't he save her? But Eri thought that saying something like that was very frivolous. Dick said they could come back earlier because they had enough animal eyes to pass the exam. But Eri wanted to kill as many enemies as possible in the remaining time. Dick decided not to stand aside. Moreover, it was beneficial for them to fight, since their cultivation increased during battle. Dick supported Eri's crazy idea. 2 days later, they killed dozens more. Eri suggested distributing the proceeds from joining the academy. Dick didn't object. Eri even admired Dick's ease. When they returned, everyone was whispering about the 2 stars. But Dick and Eri were amused that no one knew who exactly had inflicted severe damage on the opponents. Suddenly Chuck greeted them, and he asked if they were both having fun. After all, Eri was wearing the prince's clothes, but his pants were torn. His words confused them. Then Chuck began to hint at what happens when an unapproachable prince and a cold beauty collide. Eri was tired of listening to his chatter, and she kicked the guy with all her might, and she threatened that if he said something like that again, she would kill him. Soon they decided to announce the results of the first stage. Those who have completed it will stay here to rest and prepare for the next stage. The man said that 2 senior mentors would be keeping order today. At that moment, the girls came out to everyone. Feeling their powerful aura, everyone was delighted. The mentors were called Yara and Dora. Many were amazed by their beauty. Yara asked no one to break the rules, because there would be no mercy for anyone. Dick thought this silhouette looked familiar. He couldn't help but think of Sarah. It was funny that she ended up becoming an empress. Eri immediately guessed that they were students in the palace. Chuck explained that the students could wear brocade clothes outside the palace. Dick and Eri became interested in his words. Chuck explained that at Western Academy, women were in charge. After listening to him, Dick decided that Yara and Dora were some of the best students. Chuck continued that more than 30 people died in the first phase this year. Suddenly Dick tensed. The prince was walking towards him, and he intended to kill Dick. Then Dick told Chuck that the prince had already reached the absolute extreme, and Chuck said that then he could become the first in the exam. But Eri asked what the benefit was. Chuck said that whoever took first place was given 3,000 merits. Dick was surprised that with such support, he could get a lot of resources for cultivation. Chuck continued that the main thing at the next test was to prove yourself. He said that there were tests of fighting spirit, strength of spirit, and will, as well as talent. Soon everything became quiet. Yara was curious if a genius would appear this year. Dora replied that several of the dead could have come up, but alas. Yara assumed that the newcomer who killed them must be much stronger. Out of curiosity, they decided to observe everything personally. Dora suggested that he could become her new toy. The first 10 students were supposed to enter the tower. The elders discussed the outstanding students, and they were confident that the prince would definitely pass the 3rd level of the 2nd floor. Everyone was surprised when the prince climbed to the 2nd floor in just 10 minutes, and some girls discussed the prince with delight. The elders were also surprised when the prince climbed to the 3rd floor. He came out soon after. He was immediately asked if he had passed the 1st level of the 3rd floor. The prince said he passed it, but was defeated at the next one. At that time, many decided that the prince was a genius. Soon, 10 more candidates were due to enter the tower. Everyone also turned their attention to the girl who activated the mark at the age of 4. She enjoyed all the attention, and all the men were delighted by her smile. Dick had more hopes for Eri, who was supposed to get through the 3rd floor. But both girls did not advance beyond the 1st level of the 3rd floor. Chuck suddenly said that he had hoped to get at least into the top 10, but there were a lot of competitors this year. Eri told him that when a great man loses faith in himself, he has trampled his entire reputation. But Chuck was offended that the girl was making fun of him. The elder listed the following candidates. When Dick stepped forward, many people started talking about him. Dick thought that the people who came in with him did not pose much competition for him. Chuck said goodbye to Dick, and Dick soon approached his portal. He didn't understand what was happening here, because there were no people or traps. There was only a magical portal, but Dick was wary. The one Dick was supposed to fight appeared from the portal. Dick asked if he was the strongest representative of the middle level of the absolute realm. The guy replied that he had been the best for several hundred years. Dick asked what would happen if he completely destroyed it. The guy replied that Dick would be able to get straight to the second level, and in the future replace him as the security guard of this place. Dick was satisfied with these conditions. Yara wanted to leave, because in her opinion no one deserved attention. But Dora stopped her. A powerful warrior of the absolute realm stage appeared. The girl was surprised that anyone could resist that guard. Dick confidently attacked the enemy. He delivered a powerful blow, but the opponent dodged. Suddenly Dick apologized to him. It turned out that he had fallen into Dick's trap. Once in the air, he was in the palm of Dick's hand, and he landed several strong blows, but the enemy decided to use his own technique in response, and was able to destroy Dick's attack. Dick reacted when he started to be attacked. The guy was surprised when an enemy blade appeared near his face, and he was surprised when Dick defeated him. He immediately admitted that Dick was his superior, so he decided to send Dick to the second floor. Dick was delighted by this news, and at that very moment he began to move. He was soon surprised that the rooms and opponents were the same. The guy repeated again who he was, and that Dick had to defeat him. Then Dick asked if he was going to use a gun. The guy replied that if he used weapons, no one would be able to advance further. After listening to him, Dick decided to begin. There was a loud explosion. However, Dick missed and immediately noticed that they were approaching him from behind. Just like last time, the guy attacked only with his fists. He struck Dick's sword with all his might. This caused him to be thrown back. He was surprised that the opponent's blow and speed were astonishing. But I decided to use the all-seeing eye. Then he clearly saw all the enemy's movements as he approached him. And having said that he sees absolutely everything, he struck. And the blow struck him. But when a guy appeared behind Dick, he realized that he had killed the clone. Then he began to turn towards him, and created a protective barrier. However, the enemy was immediately able to break it. The recoil sent Dick flying backwards. The guy suddenly said that he hadn't met such talented opponents for a long time. Dick was surprised that his defense was destroyed with one blow, and he asked if his opponent was the most talented. The guy just said that strong opponents should be treated with respect. Seeing that the guy could release his chi, Dick thought he was a monster. At that moment, dozens of blades were already flying at him, and Dick had nowhere to run. Then Dick thought that if he hadn't cultivated to the highest realm, he wouldn't have been able to win. Having come to his senses, he struck back. But none of them wanted to give up their positions. Suddenly the direction of the swords changed. Because of this, Dick had to run away. But the opponent was watching his every move. And again he directed all his forces at Dick. Dick had to defend himself. He created a tornado that instantly reflected all the blades. Seeing this, the guy thought that Dick was a martial arts genius. And then he hit the tornado with all his might. Having destroyed it, he began to approach Dick. The elders watched with interest and wondered how many blows Dick could withstand. Yara thought that if Dick defeated a 100-year-old legend of Western Academy, it would attract a lot of attention. Dora asked her to watch carefully. Dick was able to dodge the blow. And then he swung his sword and attacked himself. He thought that there was still very little time left before the impact. And at the right moment, he attacked without a weapon. Their collision created another shockwave. Because of this, they also distanced themselves from each other. The guy suddenly said that he would like to live with Dick in the same era, and maybe they would even become friends. Dick replied that since the guy valued him so much, he should make every effort to take him into account. The guy agreed and used his 8th technique. The guy's eyes immediately shone even brighter, and then a water dragon appeared behind his back. Dick thought this was too much. While attacking, the guy asked not to disappoint him. Dick tried to resist the dragon, but he couldn't cut this dragon. Because of this, I came under his attack. Dick was thrown back and the dragon disappeared. Dick was convinced that this was the strongest opponent he had ever faced in his life, but he told the guy that he would resign. After that, energy began to gather around Dick. Meanwhile, his opponent was also preparing an attack, and this was already his 9th reception. Having prepared themselves, the opponents rushed towards each other. Their confrontation shook everything around. As a result, their energy merged. The guy thought that Dick would definitely become a hero in the future, and Dick thought that his opponent had achieved incredible strength. When they were exhausted, they were thrown apart. The elders watched with interest, not understanding who would win. The boys moved in opposite directions from each other. Dick knew that if he took one more hit, he would definitely lose. At that moment, the guy acknowledged Dick's victory. He explained that at that level he could have made 9 hits, but he still couldn't beat Dick. Dick knew that he had put less than half his strength into the first blow, and only into the very last one did he put all his strength into it. He continued that the other warriors only needed to withstand 1 hit to pass the level. Dick said goodbye and said that after recovery he would continue climbing. Then everyone saw that the third floor of the tower was on fire. Everyone was surprised, not understanding who could have gotten there. Then the elder said that it must be Dick. Then the man asked to bring him information about Dick. Soon a scroll was brought to him. The elder made fun of his face and asked if he had eaten something bad for breakfast. But he was surprised, not understanding how this was possible. And then he told the elder to look at it. After reading everything that Dick had managed to do over the past year, he was shocked by these achievements. If he had been told earlier that the prince was such a genius, he would have immediately accepted him as a student. Everyone heard when the elder read the information and were also surprised. Only the prince was angry and still wanted to kill Dick. But he was asked to think it over. Soon the guard said that there was no need to fight on the first level of the third floor. After all, when he was at the second stage of the third level, he had already passed it. Then Dick had a question, but he wasn't sure it would be answered. The guard agreed to answer one question. He asked if the boy was the strongest in the last 600 years among all 7 regions. The guy replied that this was the case before Dick appeared, and in the future, he could become a tower guard. But Dick wasn't interested. He was proud that he was able to fight such a man. As a sign of mutual respect, they shook hands. Dick didn't expect things to take such a turn. He couldn't even imagine how things would turn out if Mia met him while passing the tower. Dick only now realized that he actually missed his sister and mother, because in this life he only had them. He swung the door open. Meanwhile, the elders watched him and discussed him. Dora said they couldn't let a newcomer take their lead, and Yara agreed with her. Dick saw a sign that said he should fight only with his hands. He immediately decided that this was a good test of strength in hand-to-hand combat. His opponents were steel soldiers. Dick decided not to stand on ceremony. He immediately rushed towards the soldiers and hit the first one. But he didn't hurt them, so Dick realized that if he was surrounded, he would lose. At the same time, he struck another blow, but suddenly the soldier showed a weapon. Dick was surprised to see this. When he was attacked, he was unable to dodge. However, he quickly found his balance and landed. He decided that it was very dangerous for a mortal to fight against such warriors. At that time, he was attacked from behind. Dick decided to use the dragon technique and dealt a crushing blow. Soon he rushed towards the remaining soldiers, and he also began to destroy them. However, they continued to approach him from all sides. Dick immediately noticed the approaching soldiers. That's why I managed to dodge. And then he used his techniques. This is how he was able to deal with all the soldiers. Thinking that few could stand this, he took the pill. Meanwhile, everyone was discussing Dick, who still hadn't left the tower. Irie was worried about him, but Chuck said that since they had fought together, she should understand what he was capable of. He continued that his father grew up with the king, but even the king was not as good as the prince. Knowing how difficult the tests were, Dick could guess why no one could pass them. He thought that it was not worth going up to the 4th floor, so as not to shine too brightly. Suddenly someone came out in front of him. He was surprised to see the mentors. Yara told him that Dick should not go up to the 4th floor. But Dick replied that when he doesn't want to go there, and when he is forbidden to go, there are 2 different things. Yara replied that they wanted to save Dick, not harm him. Dora continued that Dick's grades were high, and this could already put him in mortal danger. But since they didn't know each other and cared so much about Dick, he assumed they had other goals. Yara asked if he had heard about the 3rd devil in the Western Palace. Yara continued that the girl greatly admired her ancestors. Dora intervened and said that if she found out that Dick had defeated the guard, she would challenge the guy to a duel to kill him. Dick was scared but replied that he wasn't sure about it. He already knew that sometimes it was impossible to reason with a woman. Thinking about this, he sighed. Dick said he wouldn't go to the 4th floor if they promised him something. Yara was outraged by this, but Dora offered to listen to him, and she herself wanted to have fun with Dick later. Dick said that they should have already known that the students from different kingdoms disliked each other. Many people already hated Dick. Dick hoped that when something threatened him, the mentors would help. They were surprised that this was all Dick wanted. Yara said that they wouldn't dare do whatever they wanted in front of their mentors. They promised to help Dick while he was in their palace. Having agreed, Dick decided to leave the tower. The teachers followed him out. Yara wanted to teach Dick some techniques, but Dora asked her not to kill the guy, because she also had plans for him. Everyone was alarmed when the prince came out. The man forbade lying about how many stages Dick had completed. Dick asked why he should lie, since there was nothing wrong with it. Then the man ordered to bring the mirror of the soul. Everyone was surprised to hear that Dick had passed the 2nd level of the 3rd floor. And then everyone started chanting his name. Chuck recounted how angry the prince was when he learned that Dick had passed the 2nd level of the 3rd floor. Aerie replied that now no one would dare to belittle them. But Dick said they were still weaker. The prince was angry that Dick had stolen his primacy. Now he thought it was time to use Zdan. When the mirror was brought, everyone was surprised that the guy actually beat all the mannequins. The elder said that no one had been able to pass this level for a very long time. Everyone thought that because of his strength, Dick should be number 1 on the list. Later, for his services, Dick was given permission to enter, and the key indicated a room in the dormitory. It was the key to the dormitory in the Dragon Palace. But Eri felt like something was wrong with this place. Chuck replied that a lot of spiritual power accumulated in this place, and only the best of the first years could live in it. He also heard that when a person entered the palace, he became disabled, like last year's best freshman who broke his legs. Eri was surprised that the elder didn't care about it. Chuck said the she-devil insisted that the guy broke into her room while she was taking a shower. Eri asked how he dared to enter there if he knew that 3 elders lived there. Dick realized that this place was dangerous, and Chuck asked him to be careful. Suddenly, Eri invited Dick to stay with her for the night. Dick turned around immediately, not understanding why she was suggesting it. Eri explained that she was simply afraid that the boy's legs would be broken. But Dick refused, because suddenly she would take advantage of the fact that he was sleeping and take his head to the black market. Chuck asked why Dick refused if Eri had such affection for him, and he said that when they returned to their homeland with the child, the king and queen would be happy. Then he was hit in the face again. Eri was furious at his words. She said that if Chuck didn't stop talking nonsense, she would trample his rotten tongue. Seeing how angry Eri was, Dick decided that girls were not to be messed with. Afterwards, Eri said that she didn't care about Dick, and that he should be careful because next time she would kill him at any moment. She didn't understand why she wanted to help him, and she couldn't kill him, even though she was a killer. When the girl started to leave, Chuck tried to stop her. When Dick arrived at the palace, the girl was already wondering how quickly they would kick him out of here. Arriving at the right place, he was surprised to hear someone's voice, and assumed that the place was already occupied. But afterwards he was even more surprised. After all, I saw that a girl was taking a bath there. Dick thought they were using this trick again, and if they caught him, they would break his legs. And for the opportunity to see such a beautiful back one could gouge out one's eyes. But then he came to his senses, thinking that the girl had stripped naked just to overcome him. That's why he decided to leave here. But the girl had already noticed him, and did not understand how he got there. Realizing he had been spotted, Dick decided to fight. Approaching her, Dick prepared to hit her. But at that moment she noticed Dick approaching. However, she didn't have time to dodge and fell under his attack. She quickly flew back and screamed. And on top of that, she hit her back against the wall. Because of this, she received damage. Dick was surprised that the girl's skin was so soft, and that he dealt with the devil so easily. Then the girl asked how he dared to burst into her room. Dick said their tricks were sneaky, but he wouldn't use them. He immediately decided that she had serious injuries, and even thought that there might have been a misunderstanding. Taking off his outerwear, he covered the girl. Losing consciousness, she said that she would kill Dick. Looking at her, Dick thought that she really was a beauty, and then he decided to give her a healing pill. Now he was not surprised that many had paid with blood trying to seduce her. He then set about healing her wounds. Dick thought that the items obtained in the first round of the exam could be sold at a good price. The girl's whole body ached, and she didn't remember what happened yesterday. Opening her eyes, she remembered that Dick had been watching her in the shower, and then knocked her out. Suddenly she wondered how Dick could have ended up in her room. Having stood up, she immediately asked Dick with displeasure what he had done to her. Dick replied that she was safe now, and that yesterday was not his only fault. The girl agreed that she didn't have to take a shower to seduce him, and asked what Dick wanted. Dick was not surprised to learn that a trap had been set for him after all. Dick told her to just correct her mistake and said he would come back here at night. But the girl tensed up, wondering what Dick would want to do at night. Soon Dick ran into Dora. She immediately asked if Dick was okay. Dick asked why she was asking and what could have happened to him. The girl said that she simply assumed and guessed that her plan had failed. Afterwards he asked to visit Yara, since they had a misunderstanding the previous night. When the girls saw that Dick was still in the palace, they were surprised. After Dick gave the crystals to Eri, he decided to return to the palace. But suddenly something started to approach him. The powerful attack immediately caused damage in the area. Someone immediately asked the guy if his name was Dick. Dick guessed that the one who attacked him was called Zhdan. The guy replied that since the wild man knows him, he should understand why they came for him. The guy said that out of respect for the prince's status, he would let the guy choose exactly how he wanted to die. Dick was surprised that he was already surrounded, and the elders didn't care. Someone answered him that life and death are predetermined by fate, so he must fight Zhdan. But Dick turned to him and said that if the boy's face didn't hurt anymore, he could kick him again. The guy was offended when he heard this. Zhdan said that the others should not talk to Dick, and that it would be better to kill him, and he would take the consequences upon himself. Suddenly someone intervened and asked Zhdan to stop tormenting people. The guy said that in the battle against Dick they would have only one path: death. Turning around, Dick assumed it was his fourth brother. He was glad to see Dick and told him that he showed great promise. but Dick decided that the fourth brother's appearance did not match the prince's. Then the fat man came out in front of Dick and said that Zidane should fight him first. Zidane asked him if he hadn't been beaten enough, and immediately told him to leave, because there was no time for him. But the prince was offended that he was simply driven away. Dick immediately decided that the fourth prince was often bullied, but he still stood up for Dick. At that moment, Zhdanov's assistants joined in and began insulting the prince. One of them suggested that the prince crawl through his legs, and then he would be merciful. The prince immediately replied that he would fight them today. With these words, he rushed into battle. Dick immediately noticed that the fourth brother was brave, but not strong. When the prince attacked, his attack was easily blocked. Dick could immediately see that the enemy was about to respond, but the fourth prince did not have time to react and dodge. His opponent was about to show him what happens when he gets messed with. He suddenly grabbed the scarf that the prince had around his neck. He was surprised to feel himself being pulled. Holding onto the scarf with one hand, the second guy punched the prince in the stomach. The fat man was immediately thrown back by the powerful blow, but he was able to stay on his feet. Suddenly his opponent picked up a stone from the ground, and he threw it at the prince. He managed to react and put his hand under the stone. However, the boy was delighted when cracks appeared on the thrown stone. The next moment, the prince was surrounded by purple smoke. Dick realized that the hidden motive behind the fight was murder, and he did not want to accept it. After inhaling the smoke, the guy was neutralized. His opponent said that the prince had overestimated himself and was going to end the fight. When he beat the fat man, he ordered him to be stripped and thrown into a dung pit. But before he could finish speaking, a stone flew into his face. Dick intervened and asked the boy if he believed Dick could beat him. The guy was outraged by this and asked who Dick thought he was. The fat man then told Dick not to worry about him and to seek protection from the elders. Suddenly, Dick's silhouette disappeared. His opponent didn't understand what this meant, but the next moment he was already grabbed by the face. Zidane was surprised by Dick's strength and speed, and realized that the guy couldn't continue to improve. Having hit his opponent, Dick threw him back several meters, but he immediately caught up with him and dealt another blow. The enemy couldn't respond, but Dick continued to beat him, and he used one of the most powerful techniques on him. Having finished with this, he jumped back, but his opponent was still intact, and even asked if Dick intended to destroy him with this power. He decided to move on to the main part and asked Dick to show his trump cards. But Dick asked the guy if he thought Dick should destroy his legs and arms. Hearing this, the boy thought Dick was crazy, and then Dick told him to attack. Having done so, the guy immediately found himself next to Dick and swung. But Dick was preparing to block his blow. He was able to easily stop the enemy fist. Feeling a powerful force, the guy realized that things were bad. Zidane said that Dick released his energy into the ground, so it was worth fighting him face to face. But at that moment, Dick was already preparing to attack again. He swung and hit his opponent in the torso. His attack immediately blinded their faces and everything around them, and the guy flew back from the blow. The girls were surprised that Dick was in no way inferior to his opponent. While his opponent was flying back, Dick had already managed to move behind him. And again, he used one of the most powerful techniques. Having received the blow, the guy flew to the side and crashed into a tree. Afterwards, Dick turned to Zidane, wanting to settle scores with him. But he replied that Dick would have to pass a test to fight him. Having said this, he suddenly reached out his hand towards Dick. Upon learning of this attack, Dick's brother tried to warn him of the danger. He shouted that the diamond finger was very dangerous. But Dick was calm as always. Having attacked Dick, the guy immediately walked past him. Everyone had mixed emotions when they thought Dick might die. When the boy turned away, a light appeared around Dick. The others noticed this and warned their comrade about it. Hearing their warnings, he turned around. And then he saw that they were going to hit him in the face. Because of his confusion, Dick was able to kick him in the face. Having received the blow, he stepped back and grabbed the bruised area. Then Dick admitted that he was going to kill the guy with one blow. Then Dick's opponent admitted that he was indeed ruthless. But since Dick humiliated him, he got angry and wanted to beat Dick to death. Dick continued that if this was all the boy could do, he would die. He decided to show his best skills to the best freshman. He said Dick would consider it an honor. At that moment, many hands were pointed at Dick. Dick decided that the guy needed to be destroyed before he used the power of blood, otherwise he would lose. Reacting and moving quickly, Dick began to destroy the hands. Zidane shouted to his boyfriend that he shouldn't underestimate Dick. But he replied that no matter how strong Dick was, he was still several steps lower. He continued to attack, and Dick destroyed his attacks each time. In the end, he destroyed almost all the hands that were directed at him. But his opponent did not give up and continued to attack. He pointed his largest hand at Dick. Dick was unable to dodge and the huge hand crushed him. Out of worry for his brother, the fourth prince even burst into tears. And Zidane decided that Dick got off easy by dying like that. However, a crack began to appear on the hand that had crushed Dick. Eventually, it collapsed, causing the caster to tremble in fear. Dick was completely unharmed. Then he told the guy not to move, or he would break his wrist. Having said this, he instantly approached his opponent, and he prepared to hit him while he was terrified. Dick swung the weapon he had, and it almost caught the guy's face. Due to the surprise, he didn't have time to do anything, and losing his balance, he began to fall, bleeding. Pointing to the knife in his hand, Dick asked if they wanted it back. These words offended Zidane, and he asked how Dick dared to behave like that. Dick waved his sword and said he had nothing to fear. At that moment, he was about to plunge the knife into his opponent. Many were surprised, but Zidane decided to act more rudely. Looking at the guy, Dick said that he hated people like him the most. Then he stepped on his face with his foot. Then Zidane intervened and said that if Dick continued, he would break all the bones of the fourth prince. Dick stopped immediately and told them to let his brother go. Zidane replied that in the academy, one must rely only on strength, and when one must bow one's head, one is obliged to do so. These words angered Dick. At that very moment, Zidane squeezed the fat man's head. This was the last straw, and then Dick rushed at Zidane. By hitting the boy's hand, he was able to free his brother. At that moment, Zidane ordered his men to attack Dick simultaneously. They obeyed the order and immediately surrounded the guy. The fourth prince told Dick to run away, because there were too many enemies. Dick replied that they were condemning themselves to death. At that moment, he began to move very quickly and attack each opponent. Within a few moments, all of Zidane's men were neutralized. Zidane said that Dick really did have skills, but he was tired of it. He decided to fight Dick himself and end it all. At that moment, a female voice was heard, amused by what was happening. Hearing him, Zidane immediately turned around in fear. And smiling sweetly, he greeted his mentor Dora. Dick wondered if she had come here to cause him trouble, but the girl said that she had not come here for Zidane. Pointing at Dick, she continued that she came for him. Zidane was outraged that Dick killed his brother, so he received permission from the elders to take revenge. Dora was angry that Zidane used other elders to put pressure on her. Frightened, Zidane said that he would never have dared to do such a thing. Dora asked why he was so scared, since she had no intention of causing trouble for anyone. Everyone was surprised, guessing that Dora was going to protect Dick. Dick intervened and told Zidane that in a month they would fight to the death. But when Dora heard this, she thought Dick had gone crazy. What he heard amused Zidane. Dick replied that there would be a fight in a month and he would break Zidane's arms. Zidane was pleased with what he heard and immediately agreed. The girls weren't sure whether Dick was brave or just stupid. Soon Dora told Dick that he could die in the fight. Dick thanked her for her help, but said that he had to sort out this feud himself. After finishing speaking, he ate the pill. Dora replied that even if there was a reason to fight, it was not necessary to sacrifice oneself. Dick answered her that resentment is not just about fights and feuds between students. Due to the feud, the confidence of the students from their kingdom was declining, and eventually things reached the extreme. Hearing this, Dora understood the situation, and she said that she was pleased to look at the best among the first-year students. 10 days later, Dick was training hard, but he decided that he needed to compete with the master in order to master some techniques. Soon after, he decided to return. For this, he wanted to find a cat, but suddenly Dick heard a noise outside the door. The cat didn't want to step aside and let the girl through, since Dick was training inside. But Yara refused to give up and was going to use force against the cat. The cat was outraged that the girl behaved so brazenly in front of the emperor. Then Yara told him one last time to get lost, but the cat also refused to give up and decided to attack her. Yara swung her sword and easily threw the cat back, and she said that the cat was too slow for her.